At breakfast on Saturday, my daughter-in-law slammed a forged deed on the counter and demanded the paperwork for my beachfront house in front of my 10-year-old granddaughter. When I refused, she slapped me so hard my hearing aid flew off and shattered on the floor. I did not scream. I made 2 phone calls. 36 minutes later, a woman walked up our porch. When my son saw who it was, he dropped to his knees and started crying. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a harsh lesson to someone who mistook your silence for weakness. My name is George. I am 70 years old. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer building bridges across this country. I know how to calculate weight limits. I know exactly how much pressure a foundation can endure before it cracks. My son Aaron and his wife Heather thought my personal foundation was crumbling. They believed my age made me a fragile structure they could easily demolish. They moved into my primary residence 2 years ago under the guise of keeping me company. The company they provided was a relentless campaign to strip me of my assets. They looked at a tired African-American man and saw an open vault. They did not see the steel reinforcement hidden inside. I watched them calculate my expiration date. I remained silent. My silence was never submission. My silence was observation. The breaking point arrived on a Saturday morning. The smell of burnt toast hung heavily in the kitchen air. I sat at the granite island eating my oatmeal. Mia, my 10-year-old granddaughter, sat across from me coloring in a large sketchbook. Mia is the only pure thing left in this house. Heather marched into the kitchen. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. The sound was a deliberate attempt at intimidation. She did not say good morning. She slammed a thick stack of legal papers directly over my bowl of oatmeal. The top page bore the official embossed seal of Chatham County. It was a property transfer deed for my Savannah beachfront house, the house I built with my own 2 hands. Heather crossed her arms. Her blue eyes were cold and demanding. "Sign it, George," she commanded. The tone was not a request. It was an order from a warden to a prisoner. "We are finalizing the portfolio consolidation today. Aaron and I need the Savannah property transferred into our holding account to secure a new commercial investment line. You are getting too old to manage coastal real estate. Sign the paper. Do it right now." I looked down at the signature line. Someone had already forged my initials on the lower margins of the document. The forgery was sloppy but arrogant. I looked across the counter at Mia. The little girl had stopped coloring. Her shoulders were tense. Her eyes darted between her mother and me. She knew the fighting was about to start. Heather noticed my gaze shifting toward the child. She placed her hands flat on the granite counter and leaned in close to my face. "Do not make this difficult in front of Mia," Heather whispered. Her voice carried a venomous edge. "Sign the deed, George. Make it easy on the family. You owe us for this." I owed them absolutely nothing. They lived under my roof rent-free. They drove luxury vehicles I paid off entirely. They consumed my resources while plotting my ruin. I looked Heather directly in the eyes. I slid the papers back across the smooth granite surface. The forged deed slipped off the edge and fell onto the floor. "I am not signing anything," I stated clearly. "The Savannah house belongs to me. It will never belong to you. I will not fund your delusions of grandeur." Heather lost her mind. The calm rejection completely shattered her facade of control. Her face flushed red with unadulterated rage. She raised her right hand. She swung it down with all her strength. The physical slap echoed through the quiet kitchen like a gunshot. The brutal impact snapped my head sharply to the side. The plastic casing of my hearing aid dislodged from my ear. It hit the ceramic tile and shattered into 3 distinct pieces. Mia screamed. She covered her ears and buried her face in her sketchbook. She began to sob quietly into the paper. I did not scream. I did not raise my hand to strike back. I tasted the sharp metallic flavor of copper in my mouth. A thin line of blood trickled down my chin from a cut on my inner lip. I wiped the blood away with the back of my hand. I looked down at the shattered pieces of my hearing aid on the floor. I looked back up at Heather. She stood there breathing heavily. Her chest heaved with adrenaline. She expected me to shout. She expected me to surrender to her violence. I stood up from the wooden stool. I walked past her without uttering a single word. I walked into the hallway and picked up the landline phone mounted on the wall. I dialed the first number from memory. Gregory answered on the second ring. "Gregory is my attorney. He has been my trusted attorney for 25 years. Gregory, execute the final documents," I said into the receiver. "The containment protocol is active." Gregory did not ask any questions. He understood exactly what those words meant. I hung up the phone. I dialed the second number. A woman answered the line immediately. "Valerie," I said, "you have the green light. The suspects are at the primary residence. Proceed with the warrant." I placed the receiver back on the hook. The trap was officially set. The steel doors were locking around them. I returned to the kitchen. I sat back down on my stool. I pulled Mia close to me and shielded her eyes. Heather was pacing the floor frantically shouting about lawyers and nursing homes. I ignored every single word she said. I simply watched the clock on the wall. 36 minutes later, a heavy knock echoed through the front door. The sound was rhythmic. It was authoritative. Aaron came down the stairs in his bathrobe, rubbing his eyes. He walked down the hall and unlocked the deadbolt. He pulled the heavy oak door open. A woman stood on the porch. She wore a dark windbreaker with bold yellow letters across the back. 2 armed tactical agents stood right behind her. Aaron did not yell. He did not ask what was happening. He did not act confused. He looked at the woman on the porch. The color drained completely from his face. His knees buckled immediately. He dropped straight to the hardwood floor. He put his hands over his face and began weeping loudly like a broken child. The grand illusion of his absolute power vanished in an instant. The brutal reckoning had finally arrived today. Justice was no longer a silent threat. He was completely trapped. Heather abandoned her aggressive posture in the kitchen. She marched past me with her jaw clenched tight. Her high heels struck the floorboards like rapid gunfire. She reached the open doorway where Aaron remained collapsed on his knees. Heather glared at the woman in the dark windbreaker. She demanded the stranger step off her property. She threatened to call the local city police. She declared her husband was a highly respected businessman who did not tolerate harassment. The woman on the porch did not flinch. She did not raise her voice or display any sign of intimidation. She calmly reached inside the inner pocket of her jacket. She retrieved a black leather wallet and flipped it open with a swift, practiced motion. A gold shield caught the gray morning light. She introduced herself as Valerie, a senior investigator operating directly under the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Heather scoffed, attempting to dismiss the federal credential as an elaborate prank. She reached out to slam the heavy oak door shut. Valerie placed her combat boot firmly over the threshold. She pushed the door wide open. 2 armed federal agents materialized behind her. They stepped into the foyer, their tactical gear shifting with menacing intent. One agent gently but immovably pushed Heather against the wall. Heather shrieked in protest. She demanded a warrant. Valerie looked down at Aaron. Aaron was still sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. His tears were not tears of confusion. They were the tears of a guilty man realizing his elaborate facade had completely disintegrated. Valerie pulled a thick stack of stapled documents from a rigid briefcase. She dropped the paperwork directly onto the floor in front of Aaron's weeping face. It was a formal federal indictment. Valerie began reading the charges aloud. Her voice echoed off the high ceiling of the foyer. The indictment listed 32 counts of aggravated wire fraud. It listed 8 counts of malicious identity theft. It listed 4 separate counts of international money laundering. The volume of crimes paralyzed Heather. Valerie recited the precise dollar amounts. Aaron had siphoned over $2 million into offshore corporate accounts over the past 3 years. I stood quietly near the kitchen entrance and listened to the numbers. Heather believed her husband had earned his vast wealth through brilliant stock investments and corporate promotions. She did not know the truth. I knew the exact truth. 3 months ago, I noticed a subtle discrepancy in my retirement portfolio. A single missing decimal point caught my eye. I dug deeper and found an unauthorized change to my primary account password. I did not confront Aaron. I hired private forensic accountants. They traced the digital footprint in absolute secrecy. They discovered Aaron using my social security number, my forged electronic signature, and my professional engineering credentials to secure massive commercial loans. He funneled the stolen cash to finance Heather's designer wardrobe, luxury vehicles, and fabricated status. I gathered every shred of evidence without uttering a single word. I waited patiently for the ultimate confirmation of their profound cruelty. Heather slapping me in the face provided that exact confirmation. It proved beyond any doubt that they viewed me solely as disposable prey. The physical assault was the final trigger required to activate the trap. The 2 armed agents fanned out across the lower level of the house. They marched deliberately up the main staircase. I heard the master bedroom door swing open violently. I heard the heavy thud of furniture being shoved aside. They were actively dismantling Aaron's hidden digital infrastructure. They seized his high-performance desktop computers. They confiscated his encrypted laptops. They ripped his hidden routing servers straight from the drywall. Heather snapped out of her paralyzed state. She ran to the bottom of the staircase. She screamed at the agents to stop touching her expensive belongings. She ran back to Valerie. She insisted this was a massive, catastrophic mistake. She claimed her husband was innocent of these ridiculous charges. Valerie stared at Heather with absolute zero pity. Valerie stated the financial evidence was completely airtight. She explained that the fraudulent digital footprint originated directly from the specific internet protocol address registered to this exact house. Aaron finally spoke from the floor. His voice cracked with pathetic desperation. He begged Valerie for a leniency deal. He cried that he could explain his reasoning. He claimed he just wanted to give his beautiful wife the luxurious life she inherently deserved. He raised a trembling finger and pointed directly at me. He told the federal agent that I possessed plenty of money and I was simply refusing to spend it. His vile justification hung in the air. He firmly believed he was entitled to steal my life's work simply because he desired a higher standard of living. The federal agents marched down the stairs carrying 3 computer towers and multiple cardboard boxes filled with financial documents. They logged the confiscated items meticulously on a digital tablet. The entire grand illusion of Aaron's professional success was packed away into evidence boxes and carried right out the front door. Valerie looked down at Aaron one final time. She informed him he had exactly 1 hour to report to the federal courthouse for formal processing. She strongly advised him to secure a highly competent defense attorney before he arrived. Valerie turned on her heel and walked out the door. The agents followed her down the steps. The front door remained wide open. A harsh gust of cold morning wind swept through the devastated foyer. Silence settled heavily over the hallway. Aaron remained curled on the floorboards. He did not attempt to stand up. He did not reach out to comfort his distressed wife. Heather stood completely frozen. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid. Her brain violently rejected the sudden destruction of her elite reality. Her eyes darted wildly around the empty foyer before locking directly onto me. I remained standing calmly near the kitchen threshold. My hands were relaxed comfortably at my sides. The deep fear in Heather's wide eyes rapidly mutated into pure, unadulterated hatred. She desperately needed a target for her overwhelming anger. She could not attack the federal government. She chose to attack the quiet old man she had just assaulted minutes earlier. Heather marched aggressively toward me. She pointed her manicured finger mere inches from my nose. She screamed that this entire catastrophe was entirely my fault. She absurdly claimed I had somehow manipulated the complex bank records to frame her innocent husband. Her delusion was staggering to witness. She completely refused to accept that her lavish existence was fully funded by my stolen identity. She called me a bitter and jealous old man. She shouted that I was resentful of their youth, their ambition, and their glorious success. She took a deep, ragged breath and delivered her ultimate threat. She stated she was the absolute legal owner of this property. She claimed the forged transfer deed sitting on the kitchen counter granted her supreme authority over my life. She ordered me to pack my bags up immediately. She commanded me to get out of her house before she dialed the local police to have me arrested and dragged away for criminal trespassing. I looked at her screaming face without blinking. I did not raise my voice in response. I slowly reached into the inner pocket of my wool cardigan. I pulled out a crisp manila folder. I held it out steady toward her chest. Heather snatched the folder aggressively from my hand. She ripped the flap open. She fully expected to find a written apology or a massive financial concession. Her eyes scanned the bold black text printed across the first page. I spoke with a quiet, devastating clarity that cut through her hysteria. I informed her she owned absolutely nothing. I informed her the forged deed she slammed on my counter was utterly worthless. I told her the folder she was gripping contained a legal eviction notice authorized by the county judge. She had exactly 24 hours to pack whatever items the federal agents did not seize and vacate my premises permanently. Heather stared at the bold black text on the eviction notice. Her eyes darted back and forth across the page. She read the signature of the county judge at the bottom. She read the 24-hour mandate to vacate the premises. Her brain simply refused to process the information. She dropped the manila folder onto the hardwood floor. She let out a sharp, breathless laugh. It was the sound of a mind desperately trying to maintain a fractured reality. She pointed a trembling finger at my chest. She declared the document was a pathetic fake. She insisted I was trying to humiliate her in front of the federal agents. She screamed that her husband was a self-made millionaire. She claimed Aaron built a massive corporate empire completely independent of my pathetic retirement savings. She threatened to call her elite team of high-powered lawyers. She promised they would strip me of every single penny I owned. She promised they would throw me into the worst state-run nursing home in the entire country. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest. She stood tall, trying to project absolute authority. She was a woman fighting a Category 5 hurricane with a paper umbrella. I let her finish her frantic tirade. I stood perfectly still. A seasoned engineer always lets the failing structure groan before it completely collapses. I looked at her cold blue eyes. I spoke with a quiet, measured tone. I told her to look at her husband. Aaron was still sobbing loudly on the floor of the grand foyer. The federal agents were marching past him carrying boxes of his encrypted hard drives and financial ledgers. I asked Heather if that looked like a self-made millionaire to her. I informed her she had been living inside a carefully constructed mirage for the entirety of her marriage. I built my structural engineering firm from the ground up 40 years ago. I poured my blood and sweat into every concrete foundation we ever designed. When I officially retired, I handed the executive control over to a board of trusted senior directors. I did not hand the company to Aaron. I knew my son possessed massive ambition but absolutely zero moral discipline. Aaron is not the chief executive officer. Aaron is merely a mid-level logistics manager. His actual salary barely covers the annual property taxes on this coastal estate. Heather's face lost all its vibrant color. Her jaw went completely slack. She shook her head in rapid denial. She argued that Aaron bought her designer clothes from Paris. She argued he paid for their frequent summer trips to the Amalfi Coast. She argued he purchased the matching luxury vehicles currently sitting in my driveway. I nodded slowly. I confirmed he certainly paid for those lavish things. He paid for them by committing massive wire fraud and stealing my identity. He paid for them by routing my personal capital through offshore corporate accounts to fund her insatiable appetite for unearned status. Heather stumbled backward. Her expensive high heels caught on the edge of the hallway rug. She caught herself against the painted wall. She looked around the grand foyer of the house she firmly thought she owned. The crystal chandelier hung above us. The sweeping mahogany staircase curved upward to the master suite. She tried to cling to her last remaining piece of legal leverage. She shouted that my name was not on the deed to this primary residence. She claimed she saw the property records with her own 2 eyes. She insisted she and Aaron were the legally registered owners of the estate. I stepped closer to her. I maintained my calm and steady voice. I corrected her massive miscalculation. I explained the absolute concept of an irrevocable trust. I purchased this entire estate outright 10 years ago with cash. I did not put the deed in my name. I placed the property directly into an impenetrable legal trust established solely for my granddaughter Mia. I structured the trust with extreme precision to protect the child from her own greedy parents. I am the sole managing trustee. Aaron and Heather were never the owners. They were simply permitted to live here as temporary guests under my strict discretion. I told Heather to recall the events of the morning. I reminded her of the breakfast table. I reminded her of the forged transfer document she demanded I sign. I reminded her of the exact moment she chose to raise her hand and strike me across the face. She had assaulted the only man holding the keys to her entire existence. She had physically attacked the absolute architect of her reality. The sheer gravity of her catastrophic error finally crushed her. I watched the exact moment her internal foundation shattered completely. Her arrogant posture dissolved. Her shoulders slumped forward. She looked down at her hands as if she did not recognize them. She realized the federal agents were walking out the door with her husband. She realized she had exactly 24 hours before the local sheriff arrived to physically remove her from the premises. She realized her luxury vehicles would be repossessed by the banks by the end of the week. She realized the elite social standing she desperately craved was entirely gone. Total panic hijacked her nervous system. Her survival instinct activated instantly. If the house was lost and her husband was going to a federal prison, she needed immediate liquidity. She needed untraceable cash. She needed the emergency assets to secure her escape. Heather spun around frantically. She abandoned Aaron weeping on the floor. She ignored the federal agents walking out the front door. She sprinted toward the mahogany staircase. She kicked off her high heels to run much faster. She scrambled up the wooden stairs 2 at a time. She was panting heavily like a hunted animal. She reached the second-floor landing and sprinted down the long carpeted corridor toward the master bedroom. I followed her at a steady, deliberate pace. I walked up the stairs without rushing. I knew exactly where she was going. I knew exactly what she was trying to retrieve. Heather threw the heavy master bedroom door open. She dropped to her knees at the foot of the massive king-sized bed. She violently ripped back the expensive Persian rug covering the hardwood floor. She exposed the hidden steel floor safe embedded deep in the foundation of the house. She punched the 6-digit numerical code into the electronic keypad. Her fingers were shaking violently. She misdialed the first time. She cursed loudly and punched the numbers in again. The green light flashed brightly. The heavy steel bolts retracted with a solid metallic click. Heather grabbed the metal handle. She yanked the heavy door open. She reached her hands inside, desperately expecting to find velvet pouches filled with her expensive diamond jewelry and thick stacks of emergency cash. She leaned forward and stared into the dark metal cavity. Her frantic breathing stopped instantly. Her hands touched the cold steel bottom of the secure container. She scraped her fingernails across the bare metal, trying to find anything of value. The safe was completely empty. The cold steel bottom of the safe offered no comfort to her frantic hands. Heather dragged her perfectly manicured fingernails across the bare metal bottom. She pulled out 3 black velvet pouches and hurled them onto the master bedroom floor. The velvet pouches were completely flat. Her diamond tennis bracelet was gone. Her vintage Cartier watches were gone. The thick stacks of $100 bills she kept as her ultimate emergency fund had completely vanished. Heather let out a guttural shriek that tore through the quiet atmosphere of the second floor. She spun around on her knees. She looked out into the hallway. I stood in the doorway observing her total psychological collapse. Valerie stood directly behind me. 2 tactical agents were hauling Aaron up the grand staircase. Aaron had his hands secured tightly behind his back with heavy zip ties. Heather pointed a trembling finger at the federal agents. She accused them of robbing her. She screamed that the government mercenaries had raided her private sanctuary and stolen her personal wealth. She demanded Valerie return the jewelry immediately before she filed a massive federal lawsuit for theft and corruption. Valerie did not blink. She stepped into the master bedroom with steady authority. She reached into her tactical vest and pulled out Aaron's expensive leather wallet. The agents had confiscated the wallet during the initial sweep of the downstairs office. Valerie extracted a folded yellow receipt. She held the receipt up to the light. She informed Heather that the federal government had absolutely no interest in her shiny trinkets. Valerie read the printed text aloud. It was a formal receipt from a local pawn shop located exactly 3 towns over. The itemized list was incredibly specific. It detailed the exact diamond tennis bracelet and the specific vintage watches. The transaction date printed at the top of the receipt was exactly 1 week ago. It was last Tuesday. Heather stopped breathing. She slowly turned her head away from Valerie. She locked her eyes onto her husband. Aaron stood in the hallway surrounded by federal agents. His head hung in total shame. Tears continuously streamed down his face. Heather demanded an explanation. Her voice dropped to a terrifyingly low register. She asked him why he sold her possessions behind her back. Aaron could not look his wife in the eyes. He stared at the carpeted floor. He sobbed as he delivered the pathetic truth. The federal authorities had quietly frozen his offshore corporate accounts 3 weeks ago. The infinite stream of stolen money had completely dried up. He could not pay the massive mortgage. He could not pay the luxury car leases. He could not pay for Heather's extravagant country club memberships. He was desperate to maintain the illusion of their limitless wealth. He needed untraceable cash immediately. He turned to the dark underground of the city. He borrowed $50,000 from a violent local syndicate run by a notorious loan shark. He thought he could outsmart the criminal organization. He thought he could quickly unlock the frozen accounts and repay the illegal loan before the syndicate noticed. He was entirely wrong. The loan shark demanded his weekly payment last Monday. The criminals threatened to break his legs and burn this house to the foundation. Aaron was completely cornered. He snuck into the master bedroom while Heather was at the spa. He opened the floor safe. He emptied the contents and pawned her entire jewelry collection just to buy himself a few more days of breathing room. The perfect facade of their elite marriage disintegrated into fine dust. Heather realized the man she married was not a corporate titan. He was a pathetic fraud indebted to violent street thugs. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal completely overwhelmed her rational mind. The seething anger she harbored over losing the beachfront house transferred entirely to her husband. She let out a primal scream of pure rage. She lunged forward from the floor. She launched her body directly at Aaron. She slammed her fists into his chest. She called him a pathetic failure. She called him a worthless thief. She slapped him across the face with the exact same brutal ferocity she had used against me in the kitchen earlier that morning. Her sharp fingernails dragged across his cheek and left 3 deep, bleeding red scratches. Aaron stumbled backward against the hallway wall. He could not raise his bound hands to defend himself against her furious assault. He simply turned his face away and absorbed the violent blows from his enraged wife. The federal agent stood momentarily stunned by the sudden domestic explosion. I did not intervene. I watched the structural failure of their highly toxic partnership. A building constructed on a faulty foundation of lies will always collapse inward upon itself eventually. I turned to Valerie. I spoke with a quiet, authoritative voice. I reminded the senior investigator that this woman had physically assaulted me less than an hour ago. I pointed out that she was currently committing active domestic battery against a restrained federal suspect directly in front of armed law enforcement. I explicitly instructed the officers to place Heather in handcuffs immediately. Valerie nodded sharply. She issued a swift tactical command. The 2 massive agents stepped forward. They grabbed Heather by her shoulders and pulled her off her bleeding husband. Heather kicked and screamed like a feral animal. The agents spun her around and shoved her firmly against the master bedroom door. They pulled her arms tightly behind her back. The heavy steel handcuffs ratcheted around her wrists with a series of sharp metallic clicks. Heather gasped for air. She looked down at the steel chains binding her hands. She finally realized she was entirely powerless. She was now a prisoner inside the home she arrogantly claimed to own. The agents escorted the weeping couple down the sweeping mahogany staircase. The grand foyer felt like a processing center. Valerie informed them they would be transported to the federal holding facility. Heather stopped struggling. Her eyes darted toward the kitchen. She demanded her one legally mandated phone call. Valerie agreed. She instructed an agent to unlock Heather's right hand. Heather walked to the wall-mounted landline in the kitchen. She rubbed her bruised wrist. She picked up the receiver. She did not dial her defense attorney. She did not dial a bail bondsman. She dialed Adult Protective Services. Heather spoke into the phone with fabricated terror. She wept into the receiver. She claimed she was a terrified daughter-in-law trapped inside a nightmare. She fabricated a calculated lie. She reported that I was suffering from violent late-stage dementia. She claimed my mind had completely snapped. She told the dispatcher I had locked the family inside the house with armed mercenaries. She begged the agency to dispatch an emergency psychiatric unit immediately. She demanded a medical transport team to strip me of my civil rights. She hung up the heavy plastic phone and turned to face me. A wicked, triumphant smile slowly spread across her face. She firmly believed she had found the ultimate legal loophole. She believed she had constructed a trap I could never escape. The flashing blue and red lights of 2 local police cruisers reflected off the grand foyer windows. The federal agents had barely secured the perimeter when the local authorities arrived. A stern woman wearing a gray blazer stepped out of the lead vehicle. She carried a thick clipboard and wore a laminated identification badge. Her name was Brenda, and she was a senior caseworker for Adult Protective Services. Heather had utilized her permitted phone call to orchestrate a spectacular defensive maneuver. She knew her financial empire had collapsed. She needed an immediate legal weapon to override my eviction notice and regain total control of my assets. She chose to weaponize my age. Brenda walked through the front door flanked by 2 city police officers. The local officers tensed up seeing the armed federal agents in the hallway. Valerie stepped forward and quietly explained the ongoing federal wire fraud investigation. Brenda ignored the agents and focused entirely on the domestic situation. She saw Heather standing against the wall with her hands securely bound in steel handcuffs. Heather executed a flawless psychological pivot the exact moment Brenda made eye contact. The vicious, screaming woman who had just physically assaulted her own husband vanished. Heather instantly transformed into a fragile, terrified victim. Heather dropped to her knees and began to sob hysterically. She pleaded with Brenda for absolute protection. She claimed she was living in constant, suffocating fear. She pointed her bound hands directly at me. She fabricated a horrifying narrative with chilling conviction. She told the caseworker that I was suffering from severe, rapidly deteriorating dementia. She claimed my cognitive decline made me incredibly aggressive and paranoid. She lied straight to Brenda's face, stating that I had hired armed mercenaries to hold the family hostage. She claimed the eviction notice was a delusional manifestation. Heather did not stop at mere accusations. She immediately pushed for absolute legal authority. She demanded the caseworker initiate an emergency medical guardianship protocol right there in the hallway. She argued that she was the only adult capable of managing my complex estate and medical care. She insisted the authorities invalidate my eviction notice and mandate my involuntary transfer to a locked psychiatric facility. She was attempting a total institutional coup. She believed that stripping me of my civil rights would instantly transfer the control of the irrevocable trust directly into her hands. The local police officers turned their attention toward me. Their hands rested cautiously on their utility belts. Brenda stepped forward with her clipboard raised. She looked at me with deep suspicion. She asked me to state my full name, the current date, and my immediate location. She asked me to explain why my daughter-in-law was currently restrained. The entire room fell completely silent. The federal agents watched. The local police officers waited for my response. Aaron remained motionless against the wall, silently nursing the deep scratches on his cheek. Heather continued to whimper and perform her role flawlessly. I did not raise my voice to defend my sanity. I did not express outrage at her monstrous accusations. Arguing with a hysterical liar only validates their manufactured chaos. I looked calmly at Brenda. I invited her to step into the kitchen. I turned my back on the armed officers and walked slowly toward the granite island. I filled the electric kettle with fresh water. I turned the machine on and retrieved 2 ceramic mugs. I placed a single tea bag of chamomile into one mug. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision. Brenda followed me, keeping a safe distance. The local police officers stood firmly in the doorway. I poured the boiling water over the chamomile tea. I pushed the steaming mug across the granite counter toward the caseworker. I told her the tea would help calm her nerves during a very stressful investigation. Brenda did not touch the mug. She demanded I answer her questions regarding my cognitive health and the violent incident that had occurred in the house. I opened the small wooden drawer beneath the kitchen counter. I reached inside and pulled out a tiny black micro-secure digital memory card. I placed the small piece of plastic directly next to her steaming mug. I explained the exact origin of the memory card in a steady, measured tone. 4 months ago, I began to notice small items disappearing from my personal study. I noticed documents shifted on my desk. I realized Heather was rummaging through my private life. I did not confront her. I simply installed high-definition motion, activated hidden cameras inside the smoke detectors in every major room. I told Brenda she did not need to rely on the desperate lies of a cornered criminal to assess my mental competence. I instructed the local police officers to retrieve their digital evidence tablet. One of the officers quickly retrieved the electronic device. He inserted the tiny memory card into the side port. The high-definition video file loaded instantly on the bright screen. Brenda and the 2 police officers huddled around the digital tablet. I pressed the play button. The crystal-clear audio and video filled the tense kitchen. The footage perfectly captured the events of that exact morning. It showed me sitting calmly at the kitchen island eating my oatmeal. Then it captured Heather storming into the room. The officials watched in horrified silence as the digital version of Heather slammed the forged property transfer deed onto the counter. They listened to her viciously demand my signature. They heard her use her own traumatized daughter as a tool for psychological extortion. They watched my calm, steadfast refusal. Then the video displayed the undeniable climax. The footage showed Heather completely losing her temper. It clearly captured her raising her hand and violently slapping me across the face with maximum physical force. It showed my hearing aid shattering across the ceramic floor tiles. The video provided absolute, unassailable proof. It completely obliterated Heather's fabricated narrative of victimhood and dementia. It proved she was a violent, manipulative predator attempting to steal a house she did not own. Brenda stared at the frozen final frame of the video. The professional suspicion in her eyes instantly vanished and was replaced by a cold, righteous anger. She picked up her heavy clipboard. She clicked her pen with a decisive motion. She looked directly at the local police officers standing in the doorway. She officially instructed them to press immediate felony charges against Heather for physical elder abuse. The lead police officer nodded firmly. He turned away from the kitchen and marched back into the grand foyer. He approached Heather, who was still kneeling on the floor pretending to cry. He ordered her to stand up immediately. He informed her that the Adult Protective Services investigation was officially concluded. He stated she was now under formal arrest for the physical battery of a vulnerable senior citizen. He reached out to pull her to her feet by her restrained arms. Heather realized her master plan had completely imploded. She screamed in absolute, genuine terror. Suddenly, Aaron pushed himself off the wall. He stumbled forward into the center of the foyer. His face was still bleeding from Heather's earlier attack. The crushing weight of his federal wire fraud indictment and his dangerous debt to the violent loan shark had broken his logic completely. He raised his bound hands. He shouted for the police officers to stop. He looked directly at the caseworker and the local authorities. He loudly declared that Heather did not hit me. He falsely claimed that he was the one who slapped me across the face. He lied to the police to protect the very woman who had just assaulted him. He threw himself onto the proverbial sword to keep his wife out of a jail cell. Aaron stood in the grand foyer with blood oozing from deep scratches on his cheek. He looked directly at Brenda and the local police. He loudly declared that Heather did not hit me. He falsely claimed he slapped me across the face. He lied to the authorities to protect the woman who had just assaulted him. He threw himself onto the sword to keep his wife out of prison. I watched his pathetic display of martyrdom. I knew Aaron possessed zero genuine loyalty to his wife. His confession was a calculated tactical maneuver. He was already facing decades in federal prison for massive wire fraud and international money laundering. An additional local charge for physical elder abuse would merely be a tiny drop in a massive ocean of federal indictments. If Heather went to the county jail for assault, she would be utterly useless to his survival strategy. If he kept Heather on the outside, she could contact his remaining underground associates. She could liquidate whatever small, hidden assets they still possessed. She could secure a defense attorney or attempt to bribe the violent loan shark currently hunting him down. Aaron desperately needed a free operative on the outside to manage his collapsing empire. He was using a fabricated confession as a protective shield to preserve his last remaining asset. The lead police officer pulled heavy steel handcuffs from his utility belt. He stepped toward Aaron to secure his wrists for the local battery charge. Brenda furiously scribbled notes on her clipboard to document the shocking admission. Heather stood frozen against the wall. She did not correct her husband's blatant lie. She silently accepted his sacrifice to save her own skin. I stepped forward before the officer could lock the steel cuffs around my son's wrists. I instructed the police officer to stop immediately. I told the officer I was the sole victim of the alleged assault. I stated I required a private conversation with my son before I officially pressed charges or submitted the digital video evidence to the precinct. Brenda protested my request. She claimed the domestic situation was far too volatile to allow a private meeting. I looked at the caseworker with unyielding authority. I reminded her that my mental competence was irrefutably proven by the hidden camera footage she had witnessed. I reminded her this was my private residence, and I dictated the immediate flow of events. I demanded exactly 5 minutes alone with my son in my private study. The lead police officer nodded slowly. He stepped back and gestured toward the hallway. He explicitly warned Aaron that any sudden aggressive movements would result in an immediate physical takedown. I turned and walked down the long corridor toward my study. Aaron followed me, dragging his feet heavily across the hardwood floor. We entered the room lined with tall mahogany bookshelves and heavy leather armchairs. I closed the solid oak door firmly behind us. The silence inside the study was absolute. It was the exact room where I had drafted the complex architectural plans for hundreds of massive steel bridges. It was the precise room where I had quietly compiled the devastating financial evidence of my son's monumental crimes. Aaron stood near the center of the large Persian rug. He refused to make eye contact with me. He looked down at the floorboards like a thoroughly beaten animal. I walked around my mahogany desk and sat down in my leather chair. I looked at the man I had raised. I felt no pity for his predicament. I spoke with quiet, devastating clarity that cut straight through his arrogance. I told Aaron I knew exactly what he was attempting to achieve with his fake confession. I systematically dismantled his pathetic tactical strategy. I explained I knew he wanted Heather on the outside to liquidate his hidden offshore accounts and manage his violent street creditors. I watched his shoulders slump heavily as his survival plan evaporated. I offered him a brutal, unyielding proposition. I told him I possessed the undisputed power to send Heather directly to the county jail for felony elder abuse. I told him the video evidence captured by the smoke detector camera was absolute. I told him the local police officers standing in the foyer were ready to haul her away right now. I offered to completely drop the local battery charges against both of them. I offered to retract the video evidence from the police and let Heather walk out the front door a free woman. I offered him the exact operative he desperately needed on the outside. Aaron looked up at me. His eyes were wide with frantic hope. He asked what I demanded in return. I pulled a legal document from the top drawer of my desk. Gregory and I had anticipated this exact desperate scenario. We drafted emergency custody transfer documents 3 days ago. I slid the stack of paper across the polished wood of my desk. I told Aaron I demanded full permanent legal custody of my 10-year-old granddaughter. I told him he and Heather were highly toxic predators who destroyed everything they touched. I refused to let them use Mia as an emotional extortion tool ever again. To secure Heather's freedom, he had to sign away his biological child permanently. Aaron stared at the legal documents resting on the desk. The terms of the trade were brutally clear. He was exchanging his daughter for a tactical advantage in his criminal defense. A normal parent would scream in fierce protest or negotiate to protect their child. Aaron did not hesitate for a single second. He lunged forward and grabbed the black fountain pen resting next to my inkwell. He flipped rapidly through the thick pages to find the signature line at the back of the packet. He hastily scribbled his name on the designated lines. His signature was a frantic, messy scrawl of black ink. He did not read the custody stipulations. He did not ask about future visitation rights. He signed away his parental authority with the exact same ruthless speed he used to steal my identity. He slammed the pen down and pushed the signed papers back toward me. He demanded I go out into the grand foyer and call off the local police immediately. I took the documents and inspected his signature. The legal transfer was officially complete. I had successfully severed their final point of leverage. Suddenly, a sharp, quiet gasp echoed from the doorway. Aaron and I both turned our heads sharply toward the sound. The heavy oak door of the study was cracked open a few inches. Mia stood perfectly still, hidden in the dark shadows of the hallway. She had crept silently down the corridor to find me. She had stood directly behind the wooden doorframe and listened to the entire private conversation. She heard her biological father trade her existence for a simple get-out-of-jail card. She watched him sign the permanent custody papers without a single moment of hesitation. I saw her wide, terrified eyes through the narrow gap in the door. I saw absolute devastation shatter her innocent face. She did not walk into the study to confront us. She turned around abruptly and sprinted down the long hallway. She threw open the back door of the kitchen. She ran out into the freezing winter rain and vanished into the dark, stormy night. The freezing winter rain blew horizontally through the open kitchen door. The sudden gust of wind scattered loose papers across the floorboards. Aaron stared at the empty doorway. He did not move to chase after his own daughter. He stood frozen in the center of the study. He had just traded his 10-year-old child for a temporary shield against a federal prison sentence. I pushed past him without a single word. I walked rapidly down the hallway toward the kitchen. I looked out into the absolute darkness of the backyard. Mia was completely gone. The storm was intensifying rapidly. The heavy rain quickly washed away any visible footprints in the mud. I turned around to grab my heavy winter coat from the hall closet. Heather marched down the grand staircase. She had watched the entire custody exchange from the upper landing. She did not display an ounce of maternal panic. She did not rush to the door to search for her missing child. She pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She immediately recognized a golden opportunity to alter the narrative. She dialed the emergency tip line for the largest local news station in the county. She fabricated a spectacular story of domestic terror. She claimed a tyrannical grandfather was holding a family hostage. She claimed I had just driven a terrified little girl out into a deadly winter storm. The local news van arrived in exactly 14 minutes. They parked their heavy broadcasting vehicle directly on my front lawn. The bright white floodlights illuminated the pouring rain. A reporter and a cameraman sprinted onto my covered porch. Heather threw the front door open. She executed another flawless theatrical performance. She collapsed against the doorframe. She sobbed hysterically for the rolling camera. She pointed a trembling finger at me. She accused me of ruling the household with an iron fist. She claimed I verbally abused Aaron and psychologically tortured Mia. She stated the child simply could not endure another minute of my cruelty. She pleaded directly into the camera lens for anyone to find her missing baby. I ignored the flashing lights and the aggressive questions from the local reporter. Arguing with a manufactured media circus only provides fuel for their fabricated outrage. I walked calmly past the camera crew. I stepped out onto the wet porch. I pulled my smartphone from my jacket pocket. I opened a specific encrypted application I had installed 2 years ago. I bought Mia a durable waterproof smartwatch for her 8th birthday. I told Aaron and Heather it was a simple device for playing games and tracking steps. I lied to them. I embedded a highly sophisticated military-grade GPS tracker inside the thick rubber casing. I knew my son and his wife were fundamentally negligent parents. I required a foolproof method to ensure my granddaughter was always safe from their absolute incompetence. The application loaded immediately. A bright red dot pulsed against the digital map of the county. I watched the geographic coordinates update in real time. The tracking signal was moving steadily eastward. Mia had boarded a county transit bus. The bus was heading directly toward the coast. The final destination was entirely obvious to me. She was running toward the Savannah beachfront property. It was the exact house Heather had attempted to steal from me earlier that morning. It was the only place my granddaughter associated with safety and peace. It was the house where I taught her how to fish and how to build wooden birdhouses away from the toxic screaming of her parents. I walked down the driveway and climbed into my vintage truck. The heavy steel door slammed shut against the howling wind. I started the engine. The powerful motor roared to life. I threw the transmission into gear and accelerated aggressively down the flooded street. The news crew attempted to chase my vehicle with their bright camera lights. I left them entirely behind in the darkness. The drive to the coast usually takes 40 minutes. The severe winter storm slowed my progress significantly. The rain lashed against the windshield in violent horizontal sheets. The heavy wiper blades struggled to clear the immense volume of water. The coastal roads were beginning to flood rapidly. I navigated the dangerous conditions with absolute mechanical precision. I focused my entire mind on the blinking red dot illuminating my digital dashboard screen. The tracking signal stopped moving. The red dot stabilized directly over the geographic coordinates of the beachfront house. I turned off the main coastal highway. I drove down the long gravel driveway leading to the property. The ocean was completely enraged. Massive black waves crashed violently against the wooden pylons supporting the rear deck. The saltwater spray mixed heavily with the freezing rain. I parked the truck near the standalone boathouse. I grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight from the glove compartment. I stepped out into the brutal storm. The wind nearly knocked me completely off balance. I activated the flashlight and swept the bright beam across the exterior of the elevated house. I walked directly toward the wooden lattice skirting that protected the underside of the wraparound porch. I shined the light through the narrow wooden slats. I saw a small pair of soaked sneakers tucked behind a concrete foundation pillar. I dropped to my knees in the wet sand. I grabbed the edge of the wooden lattice panel and pulled it open. I crawled into the dark, cramped space beneath the heavy wooden deck. The smell of damp earth and salt filled the confined area. I aimed the flashlight toward the concrete pillar. Mia sat huddled tightly in the far corner. Her knees were pulled aggressively against her chest. Her winter coat was completely saturated with freezing rain. She was shivering violently in the absolute darkness. I crawled closer to her. I reached out and wrapped my heavy wool jacket tightly around her small, trembling shoulders. I expected her to weep. I expected her to break down completely after the traumatic events of the evening. I vastly underestimated the remarkable resilience of the young girl I had actively helped raise. Mia did not shed a single tear. Her young face was entirely resolute. Her jaw was set with absolute determination. She looked directly into my eyes without flinching. She reached a small, freezing hand deep into the saturated pocket of her winter jacket. She pulled out a small black plastic object. She held her hand out and pressed the object firmly into my open palm. I shined the tactical flashlight directly onto my hand. It was a high-capacity encrypted USB flash drive. I looked back up at my granddaughter. I asked where she acquired the digital device. Mia spoke with a steady voice that cut clearly through the sound of the crashing ocean waves. She told me she had slipped into the master bedroom while Heather was screaming at the federal agents. She reached deep into the hidden zippered compartment of Heather's designer purse. She meticulously extracted the drive before running away. A small strip of white athletic tape was adhered to the plastic casing. The drive was explicitly labeled Contingency E. The war had just escalated. I held the small black plastic drive in my hand. The rain continued to batter the wooden lattice of the crawl space. I guided Mia out from under the heavy wooden deck. I shielded her shivering body from the violent coastal wind. I quickly unlocked the heavy storm door of the beachfront house and rushed us inside. The interior was freezing but entirely dry. I immediately turned on the central heating system. I wrapped Mia in a thick thermal blanket. I promised her she was completely safe. I told her no one would ever force her to return to her toxic parents. She nodded silently and huddled on the living room sofa. I walked into the adjacent home office. I retrieved my secure laptop from my leather briefcase. I carried the computer back to the kitchen island. I sat down on the wooden stool and stared at the USB drive. The white athletic tape bearing the words Contingency E felt like a physical threat. I inserted the drive into the side port of my machine. The screen flickered as the operating system recognized the external device. A single folder appeared on my digital desktop. I clicked the folder icon. A massive cache of heavily encrypted files populated the screen. Heather was incredibly cunning but completely arrogant. She assumed her private digital sanctuary would never be breached by the daughter she continuously ignored. I opened the first document. It was a comprehensive export of her internet search history spanning the last 6 months. She had spent countless hours navigating encrypted web browsers and hidden dark web marketplaces. Her search queries were absolutely chilling. She had meticulously researched untraceable cardiovascular toxins. She read academic medical journals detailing compounds that mimic natural heart failure in elderly patients. I scrolled down the long digital list. I saw repeated searches for potassium chloride and synthetic digitalis. I opened the next file in the directory. It was a highly detailed spreadsheet. Heather had mapped out a complete assassination schedule. She created a highly detailed step-by-step blueprint to poison me slowly over a period of 2 weeks. She documented the precise dosages required to bypass standard toxicology screens. She calculated the exact concentration needed to ensure my death looked entirely natural. I opened the final document. It was a digital copy of the irrevocable trust agreement I had established for Mia. Heather had highlighted specific clauses in bright red digital ink. She had found a narrow legal loophole. If I died of natural causes before my granddaughter reached the age of 18, the management of the massive trust defaulted to her surviving biological parents. Heather realized she could never legally break the trust while I was alive. She decided the only method to seize the vast fortune was to eliminate the sole managing trustee. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The conflict was no longer a dispute over stolen funds or illegal property transfers. This was a calculated, premeditated murder conspiracy. Heather intended to watch me die in agony so she could maintain her lavish lifestyle. I did not waste a single second. I picked up my smartphone and dialed Agent Valerie directly. She answered the call on the first ring. I informed the senior federal investigator that the situation had radically escalated. I told her I possessed irrefutable digital evidence of a pending assassination plot. I explained that Heather had constructed a lethal blueprint to bypass my financial protections. Valerie demanded I transmit the files immediately. I established a secure encrypted connection between my laptop and the federal server. I uploaded the entire contents of the Contingency E folder. I watched the progress bar inch across my screen. The data transfer completed successfully. Valerie placed me on a brief hold while she reviewed the incoming intelligence. I looked over at Mia resting on the sofa. She was entirely oblivious to the lethal magnitude of the drive she had courageously stolen. Valerie returned to the line. Her professional demeanor was entirely gone. Her voice was sharp and urgent. She informed me that the financial fraud investigation was officially suspended. The federal agency was immediately upgrading the case to a full domestic terrorism and murder conspiracy operation. Valerie initiated a massive tactical mobilization. She dispatched a specialized hazardous materials team to my primary residence to secure the kitchen and dining areas. She ordered the local police to isolate Heather in a maximum security interrogation room. The federal government was preparing to tear Heather's entire existence apart. Valerie did not hang up the phone. She continued to analyze the raw data flowing from the flash drive. She opened a hidden ledger containing Heather's dark web cryptocurrency transactions. I heard Valerie furiously typing on her mechanical keyboard. She directly matched the digital blockchain receipts with the international shipping manifests. Valerie stopped typing. The absolute silence on the phone line caused my stomach to drop. She spoke with a grim, terrifying urgency. She told me she had successfully traced the final payment. Heather had purchased a highly concentrated liquid cardiac toxin from an underground European supplier. Valerie tracked the digital routing number. The massive cryptocurrency payment had cleared exactly 3 days ago. The lethal package was delivered to a private postal box registered in Aaron's name. Valerie instructed me to remain perfectly still. She asked me if I had consumed any food or beverages prepared by Heather within the exact past 48 hours. I ended the call. I placed the phone flat on the kitchen island. I looked down at my hands. A slight, involuntary tremor vibrated through my fingers. My pulse suddenly spiked. My chest felt incredibly tight. I closed my eyes and desperately searched my memory. I recalled the events of the early morning. I remembered sitting at the breakfast counter reading the newspaper. I remembered Heather walking into the kitchen with a strange, accommodating smile. She had offered to brew my morning coffee. She handed me a ceramic mug filled with dark roast. I remembered the coffee tasting unusually bitter. I had attributed the harsh flavor to a poorly roasted batch of beans. I drank the entire mug. I looked at my shaking hands as a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The lethal blueprint was already in motion. The horrific truth settled heavily into my bones. The woman I had permitted to live under my roof had actively poisoned me just a few hours ago. The sudden tightness in my chest intensified into a dull, throbbing ache. I focused my vision on the flashing cursor. I refused to let panic overtake my rational mind. I had survived decades in industrial construction sites. I would not allow a greedy fraud to successfully terminate my life. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my emergency medical beacon. I pressed the heavy red button. The beacon instantly notified the local emergency dispatch center of a critical cardiac event. I leaned forward against the cold granite countertop. I stared out the large windows at the churning black ocean. The storm raged violently against the glass panes. I focused on drawing slow, deep breaths into my burning lungs. I intended to survive this toxic assault. The dull ache in my chest rapidly intensified into blinding pressure. A heavy iron vice clamped around my ribcage. The synthetic cardiovascular toxin Heather sourced was aggressively attacking my nervous system. My vision suddenly fractured into dark floating spots. The kitchen cabinets warped before my failing eyes. Profound nausea crashed over me. I gripped the granite island until my knuckles turned white. I fought violently against the urge to collapse. The poison was designed to mimic a massive heart attack and incapacitate its victim within minutes. I forced oxygen into my burning lungs. I refused to die in my own sanctuary. I pushed away from the counter and staggered toward the front door. Every step required a monumental expenditure of absolute willpower. The venom systematically shut down my motor functions. I grabbed the brass handle and shoved the door open. The freezing coastal wind slammed into my face. Icy rain stung my skin. I stumbled down the wooden porch steps and dragged my failing body toward my vintage truck. I leaned against the hood to steady my trembling legs. I reached for the driver door handle and looked at the gravel driveway. The front tire was completely flat. All 4 tires were completely destroyed. Deep, jagged lacerations marked the thick rubber sidewalls. Heather had systematically eliminated my physical escape route. She slashed the tires before she fled the property earlier that morning. She meticulously ensured I would remain trapped on the isolated estate, while the lethal toxin destroyed my heart. I abandoned the useless vehicle and turned back toward the house. My breathing became incredibly shallow. The crushing pain radiated sharply down my left arm. I dragged my boots up the stairs and stumbled into the foyer. I slammed the heavy door shut against the storm. I leaned against the painted wall and desperately reached for the wall-mounted landline telephone. I pulled the receiver from the cradle. The line was entirely dead. I looked down at the base of the unit. The thick communication wires had been cleanly severed with wire cutters. Heather had severed my connection to the outside world. She calculated every variable. She wanted me to die alone in the dark. My chest pain reached a catastrophic peak. My legs finally gave out. I collapsed heavily onto the hardwood floor. The ceiling spun wildly. Darkness crept aggressively into the corners of my vision. I had exactly one remaining lifeline. I remembered the standalone boathouse located 50 yards away. I had spent the previous summer restoring a vintage marine VHF radio system. The equipment ran on an independent marine battery. It was completely isolated from the residential power grid and outside of Heather's lethal calculations. I rolled onto my stomach and dragged my body across the living room floor. I pushed the heavy back door open and crawled out onto the saturated wooden deck. The violent storm battered my weakened frame. Freezing rain soaked through my clothing. I slid down the wooden stairs and hit the wet sand. I could not stand up. I dug my fingers into the cold mud and pulled my heavy body forward. The 50 yards to the boathouse felt like an infinite, miserable marathon. The wind howled relentlessly. The ocean waves crashed violently against the shoreline. I focused my existence on the dark silhouette. Every inch of forward progress required absolute physical agony. My heart hammered erratically against my ribs. I reached the wooden door of the boathouse. I reached up and grabbed the brass handle. I pulled myself up just enough to twist the knob. I practically fell inside the dark, cramped structure. I dragged myself across the dusty floorboards toward the heavy metal workbench. The vintage marine radio sat in the corner. I reached up with a trembling hand and flipped the primary power switch. The analog dials illuminated with a warm orange glow. The machine hummed to life. I grabbed the heavy black microphone and pressed the transmission button. I broadcasted a desperate emergency mayday directly on the Universal Coast Guard Distress Channel. I clearly stated my exact coordinates and reported a severe critical medical emergency. A calm, authoritative voice responded through the static almost immediately. The Regional Coast Guard dispatcher confirmed my location. They informed me a medical evacuation helicopter was currently stationed at a nearby coastal base. They dispatched the aerial rescue team directly to my coordinates. I dropped the heavy microphone onto the workbench. The final reserve of adrenaline completely evaporated from my bloodstream. The absolute darkness finally consumed my vision. My head slammed against the floorboards. The world went completely silent. I woke up to the blinding white fluorescent lights of a hospital emergency trauma room. Medical monitors beeped frantically around my bed. Thick plastic intravenous lines pumped clear fluids directly into my arms. A severe doctor stood over me holding a thick medical chart. He noticed my eyes opening. He stepped closer and shined a bright penlight into my pupils. He asked me if I knew my name. I whispered my identity through a terribly dry throat. The doctor lowered his light. He spoke with grave professional urgency. He informed me the Coast Guard extraction team transported me to the regional medical center just in time. He stated my heart was actively failing when I arrived in the trauma bay. The toxicologist isolated a massive concentration of synthetic digitalis within my bloodstream. The lethal chemical compound precisely matched the dark web research Valerie had uncovered. The doctor confirmed the substance was designed to trigger an untraceable terminal cardiac event. He stated I survived the calculated assassination attempt by a remarkably narrow margin. The medical team successfully neutralized the venom with a massive dose of specific binding antibodies. I took a slow, deep breath. The crushing pain in my chest had subsided into a dull, manageable ache. I looked directly at the lead physician. I asked him about my current medical prognosis. He assured me I was completely stabilized. He stated I would require several days of intense monitoring, but my heart suffered no permanent structural damage. I formulated a brutal tactical countermeasure. I asked the doctor to clear the trauma room of all secondary medical staff. The nurses quietly exited the sterile room. I looked at the physician with unyielding authority. I offered him a highly unorthodox proposition. I explained the exact nature of the domestic assassination plot. I informed him that the individuals who poisoned me were currently waiting to inherit a massive financial empire upon my death. I instructed the doctor to officially update my medical chart with a fabricated prognosis. I demanded he contact my son and my daughter-in-law immediately. I instructed him to deliver a very specific, terrifying lie. He needed to tell Aaron and Heather that I had suffered a catastrophic neurological event during the cardiac arrest. He needed to inform them that I had slipped into a deep, irreversible medical coma. The doctor stared at me in profound shock. He hesitated for a moment before slowly nodding his agreement. I leaned against the sterile hospital pillows. I needed to see exactly what the greedy scavengers would do when they firmly believed the lion was finally dead. The heavy pneumatic door of the intensive care unit hissed open. I laid perfectly still against the stiff hospital mattress. My eyes were shut tight. My breathing was slow and measured. The rhythmic mechanical beep of the heart monitor provided a steady soundtrack to my fake coma. I listened as frantic footsteps rushed across the linoleum floor. Heather let out a piercing theatrical wail. Her voice was pitched to ensure maximum dramatic effect for the medical staff. She rushed to the right side of my hospital bed and collapsed against the aluminum railing. She wept loudly and called me a beloved patriarch. She begged the universe to spare my life. Aaron mirrored her highly calculated performance perfectly. He stood on the left side of the bed and spoke in a trembling, broken voice. He thanked the attending nurse for saving his dear father. The young nurse offered her deepest condolences and explained that my neurological state was completely unresponsive. She assured them that I was comfortable and feeling absolutely no pain. She quietly stepped out of the room to give the grieving family a moment of private closure. The heavy door clicked shut. Heather stopped weeping in an instant. The agonizing sobs vanished from her throat as if someone had flipped a mechanical switch. She stood up straight and violently wiped the fabricated tears from her cheeks. She let out a sharp sigh of annoyance. She complained loudly about the sterile smell of the hospital room. She wiped her hands on her expensive designer pants as if touching the metal bed railing had physically contaminated her. Aaron did not offer a single word of comfort to his allegedly dying father. He immediately stepped away from the medical monitors and scanned the perimeter of the private suite. I maintained my absolute stillness. The darkness behind my closed eyelids was a perfect theater for their treachery. I listened to the sound of their expensive leather shoes moving across the floor. They did not spend a single second mourning the tragedy that had just befallen me. They instantly transformed from grieving family members into ruthless scavengers picking at a fresh carcass. Aaron walked directly toward the thin plastic belongings bag resting on the corner visitor chair. The paramedics had gathered my personal effects when they loaded my body into the helicopter. Aaron grabbed the plastic bag and dumped the entire contents onto the small table. My leather wallet hit the surface with a dull thud. My wristwatch rattled against the plastic water pitcher. Heather rushed to the table with predatory enthusiasm. She grabbed the leather wallet and ripped it open. She pulled out my credit cards and my driver license. She cursed under her breath. She realized the plastic cards were entirely useless without the authorization numbers. She tossed the wallet back onto the table in total disgust. Aaron ignored the financial cards and focused his attention entirely on my heavy winter jacket. The wool coat had protected me during my agonizing crawl across the beach. It was still damp and smelled strongly of ocean salt. Aaron picked up the jacket and aggressively jammed his hands into the deep pockets. He searched for anything of immediate monetary value. He pulled out a ring of common house keys and threw them aside. He patted down the exterior fabric with frantic urgency. Heather leaned over his shoulder and demanded he search the interior lining. She reminded him that I always hid my most valuable assets in the most unconventional places. She stated the offshore accounts were completely frozen, and they desperately required an alternative source of immediate liquidity. She reminded Aaron that the violent street syndicate would not wait for a prolonged probate court battle. They needed untraceable bearer bonds or a secure cache of physical cash. Aaron flipped the heavy jacket inside out. He ran his palms firmly along the dark interior fabric. He stopped abruptly. I heard his rapid breathing echo in the quiet hospital room. He pressed his fingers against the thick wool material near the left breast pocket. He announced he felt a hard metallic object sealed tightly between the fabric layers. He declared it felt exactly like a security key. Heather gasped with greedy anticipation. She instructed him to rip the fabric apart. Aaron grabbed the thick collar of the jacket with both hands. He bit down on the inner lining and tore the fabric with maximum physical force. The sound of ripping wool sliced through the quiet hum of the medical machines. He dug his fingers directly into the torn cavity. He extracted a single, heavy brass key. He held the key up to the fluorescent hospital lights. He let out a breathless laugh of pure triumph. He recognized the specific shape and the unique numerical engraving stamped into the brass head. He proudly declared it was the master key to the primary safe deposit box at the central downtown bank. He confidently asserted that I kept my emergency physical reserves locked inside that security vault. He told Heather the vault undoubtedly contained enough untraceable wealth to pay off the syndicate and secure their escape from the impending federal indictments. The brass object represented their final chance at survival. Heather snatched the brass key from his fingers. She kissed the cold metal surface. She praised her husband for his brilliant discovery. She looked over at my motionless body resting in the sterile hospital bed. She sneered at my apparent vulnerability. She told Aaron I was a pathetic fool for carrying the master key directly into an early grave. She stated my medical failure was the ultimate stroke of luck they needed to secure their financial freedom. She did not express a single ounce of regret or sadness over my condition. She viewed my fake artificial coma as a highly convenient solution to their massive legal nightmare. They grabbed their coats and prepared to leave the intensive care unit immediately. They did not press the medical call button to summon the nurse. They did not leave a functioning contact number at the desk. They did not say goodbye to the man who raised them. They abandoned their supposedly dying father in the cold hospital room without a single backward glance. The door hissed open and clicked shut again. The room fell silent except for the steady rhythm of my heart monitor. I slowly opened my eyes. The bright fluorescent lights glared above me. I looked at the torn jacket resting carelessly on the small table. The scavengers had taken the bait with flawless predictability. They believed they had outsmarted the architect of their reality. They truly believed the heavy brass key was their ultimate salvation. They rushed out into the stormy morning to claim a fortune they thought I had hoarded in secret. They were rushing directly into a vault of destruction. The primary safe deposit box did not contain bearer bonds or stacks of cash. It contained something far more devastating. It contained the definitive proof of their criminal enterprise, precisely organized and waiting for the federal authorities to unseal it. I closed my eyes and allowed a cold smile to touch my lips. The trap was officially sprung. Aaron and Heather burst out of the heavy double doors of the county medical center. They sprinted through the freezing rain toward their luxury vehicle. Aaron gripped the heavy brass key tightly in his left hand. The sharp metal teeth bit deeply into his palm, but he did not feel the pain. He felt only the intoxicating rush of impending victory. They climbed into the expensive car and slammed the doors shut against the winter storm. Heather frantically wiped the rain from her designer coat. She commanded Aaron to drive directly to the central downtown bank. She insisted they had a very narrow window of opportunity before the hospital administration notified my legal representatives. They believed my fabricated coma presented the ultimate tactical opening. Aaron slammed the transmission into gear and sped away from the hospital parking structure. He completely ignored the flashing speed limit signs. The windshield wipers battered back the heavy rain as they raced toward the financial district. The imposing marble facade of the First National Bank loomed through the gray morning mist. Aaron parked the vehicle illegally in a restricted zone directly in front of the main entrance. They rushed up the wide concrete steps and pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors. The bank lobby was quiet and meticulously organized. The polished mahogany counters gleamed under the soft ambient lighting. Aaron marched directly toward the primary administrative desk. He did not ask to speak with a standard teller. He demanded an immediate audience with the senior branch manager. A young administrative assistant noticed his frantic demeanor and quickly retreated into a private rear office. A tall, imposing man emerged a moment later. His name was Thomas. He wore a sharply tailored navy blue suit and carried himself with the unmistakable rigid posture of a retired Marine. Thomas was not merely a bank manager. He was my oldest and most trusted friend. We had served together in an engineering battalion exactly 40 years ago. Aaron stepped forward and presented the brass key. He slapped a thick manila folder onto the polished mahogany desk. He spoke with aggressive, frantic authority. He claimed I was lying completely incapacitated in a hospital intensive care unit. He stated I had suffered a catastrophic neurological event and was currently in a deep, irreversible coma. Aaron produced a legal document from the folder. He shoved the paper toward Thomas. It was a comprehensive, durable power of attorney. The document explicitly granted Aaron total unilateral control over my entire financial estate. Aaron demanded immediate, unfettered access to the primary safe deposit box corresponding to the brass key. He insisted it was an absolute medical emergency requiring instant liquidity. Thomas picked up the document. He examined the complex legal jargon and the embossed notary seal at the bottom of the page. He knew instantly the document was a complete forgery. We had established a highly secure protocol regarding my assets 3 years ago, specifically to prevent this exact scenario. Thomas did not display a single ounce of suspicion. He did not challenge the validity of the forged document. He executed his role with absolute military precision. He offered Aaron his deepest fabricated condolences regarding my tragic medical condition. He nodded solemnly and assured my son that the bank would facilitate the emergency request immediately. Thomas instructed Heather to remain in the main lobby. He explained that federal banking regulations strictly prohibited non-family members from entering the secure subterranean vault during an emergency access procedure. Heather scowled but crossed her arms and leaned against the marble counter. Aaron eagerly followed Thomas toward the back of the administrative area. They walked down a long, carpeted hallway and entered a secure steel elevator. Thomas inserted his employee access card and pressed the button for the subterranean level. The elevator descended smoothly. Aaron vibrated with greedy anticipation. He clutched the brass key so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. The elevator doors slid open to reveal the primary security vault. The massive circular steel door was already disengaged for standard morning operations. The thick metal locking bolts gleamed under the bright security lights. Thomas guided Aaron into the quiet, climate-controlled room. Hundreds of rectangular steel boxes lined the walls from floor to ceiling. Thomas walked directly to Section 4. He stopped in front of a large, double-wide container. He pointed to the corresponding engraved number. He instructed Aaron to insert the brass key into the right side lock cylinder. Thomas produced a heavy silver master key from his pocket. He inserted it into the left side cylinder. They turned the keys simultaneously. The internal locking mechanism released with a heavy, satisfying click. Thomas stepped back. He gestured toward the metal handle. He politely instructed Aaron to pull the heavy drawer completely out of the wall recess. Aaron grabbed the metal handle with both hands. He yanked the heavy steel container out of the wall and carried it to the private viewing table in the center of the vault. He set the metal box down. His hands were shaking violently with absolute greed. He firmly believed the container was filled to the brim with untraceable bearer bonds, thick stacks of $100 bills, and rare precious metals. He believed he was seconds away from securing his permanent freedom from the violent street syndicate. He took a deep breath and flipped the metal latch. He threw the heavy lid open. He stared down into the interior of the container. His frantic, rapid breathing stopped instantly. The box was completely empty of cash. There were no bearer bonds. There were no diamonds. There was only a single high-resolution photograph resting face down on the cold metal bottom. Aaron reached into the empty container. He picked up the photograph with a trembling hand. He slowly turned the image over. The color photograph was incredibly clear and perfectly focused. It captured Aaron sitting in a dark booth at a notorious downtown dive bar. He was actively shaking hands with a man known to the local authorities as a highly skilled identity forger. The photograph documented the exact moment Aaron had purchased the sophisticated fake documents he used to initially steal my identity and drain my secondary accounts. Aaron stared at the image in total absolute horror. His mind violently rejected the visual evidence. He flipped the photograph over. A single devastating phrase was written across the back of the glossy paper in thick red marker. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The message stated simply, "I know everything." The absolute crushing reality of his situation crashed down upon him. He realized I had tracked his criminal enterprise from the very beginning. He realized the hidden safe deposit box was not an emergency fund. It was a meticulously crafted trap designed specifically to expose his greed. A sudden deafening alarm klaxon shattered the quiet atmosphere of the subterranean vault. Red strobe lights began flashing violently along the ceiling. Aaron spun around in a blind panic. He dropped the photograph onto the viewing table. He looked toward the vault entrance. Thomas was no longer standing inside the room. The bank manager had quietly stepped backward into the hallway while Aaron was opening the metal container. Thomas had pressed the silent emergency lockdown button located beneath the primary security desk, the exact moment he saw the forged power of attorney. The massive circular steel door began to close automatically. The heavy mechanical gears groaned as the thick metal barrier swung shut. Aaron sprinted toward the entrance. He reached out desperately to stop the moving door. He was entirely too slow. The heavy steel door slammed into the reinforced frame with a thunderous, booming crash. The massive locking bolts automatically engaged. Aaron slammed his fists against the impenetrable steel wall. He screamed in absolute terror. He was completely sealed inside a federal bank vault. The flashing red strobe lights illuminated his panicked face. He turned around and looked back at the viewing table. The photograph rested silently on the metal surface. He heard the faint wailing of multiple sirens rapidly approaching the bank from the city streets above. He realized the local police were not responding to a standard robbery. The FBI was arriving to execute a massive, coordinated raid. Thomas had instantly transmitted the forged power of attorney directly to Agent Valerie. The financial fraud case had just intersected perfectly with the ongoing federal investigation. Aaron slid down the cold steel wall of the vault. He pulled his knees tightly against his chest. He realized his master plan had entirely evaporated. He had traded his only daughter for a key that ultimately locked him inside a federal cage. The crystal chandeliers of the Oak Bridge Country Club cast a warm golden light over the pristine dining room. Heather sat at the absolute center of the most exclusive table in the entire establishment. She was surrounded by 6 incredibly wealthy and highly influential women from the local social elite. She wore a perfectly tailored black designer dress that projected an image of mourning without sacrificing an ounce of high fashion. She held a crystal flute filled with rare imported champagne. She spoke to her captive audience with a meticulously rehearsed tone of profound tragedy mixed with subtle triumph. She informed the elite circle that her father-in-law had suffered a catastrophic medical event earlier that morning. She dabbed the corners of her perfectly manicured eyes with a silk handkerchief. She claimed the doctors had declared the situation entirely hopeless. She smoothly transitioned the conversation from fabricated grief to her impending financial ascension. She proudly announced that Aaron was currently finalizing the legal transfer of the massive family estate. She boasted that they were about to inherit an empire encompassing offshore accounts and immense commercial properties. She relished the envious stares of her wealthy companions. She firmly believed her long-awaited coronation as a billionaire matriarch was finally complete. The lavish luncheon progressed with an endless flow of exorbitant delicacies. Heather aggressively dominated the conversation and ordered the most expensive items on the exclusive menu. She requested multiple rounds of beluga caviar and insisted the sommelier opened 3 bottles of vintage French wine. She viewed the extravagant expenditure as a necessary investment to solidify her new dominant social standing. She wanted every influential woman at the table to intimately understand the sheer magnitude of her newly acquired wealth. She dismissed any lingering thoughts regarding my condition in the hospital. She assumed the synthetic toxin had already completed its lethal objective, and that my physical body was simply waiting for the inevitable termination of life support. She imagined Aaron returning from the downtown bank carrying the absolute proof of their incredible fortune. She envisioned the immediate future filled with private jets and international real estate acquisitions. She laughed loudly at a polite joke made by a senator's wife. She felt completely untouchable within the secure, elegant walls of the private country club. She had successfully navigated years of calculated deception to reach this exact pinnacle of high society. The world belonged entirely to her, and she intended to savor every single second of her absolute victory. The impeccably dressed headwaiter discreetly approached the table holding a leather-bound folio. He bowed slightly and presented the final bill directly to Heather. The total cost of the extravagant celebration amounted to several $1,000s. Heather smiled with absolute supreme confidence. She casually reached into her designer leather handbag and extracted her primary platinum credit card. She placed the heavy metal card onto the silver tray without even glancing at the astronomical total. She returned her immediate attention to the ongoing conversation regarding an upcoming charity gala. The headwaiter walked silently toward the administrative desk near the kitchen entrance. Heather basked in the admiring glances of her social peers. She felt the heavy burden of her past financial anxieties completely evaporating. 10 minutes passed in comfortable conversation. The headwaiter returned to the table. His professional demeanor was strained. He leaned down and whispered discreetly into Heather's ear. He politely informed her that the banking institution had declined the transaction. Heather felt a sudden sharp spike of intense irritation. She assumed her financial institution had flagged the massive charge as a potential security risk. She scoffed loudly at the sheer incompetence of the banking system and reached back into her expensive handbag. Heather pulled a secondary premium credit card from her wallet and slapped it aggressively onto the silver tray. She loudly instructed the waiter to bypass the security protocols and run the transaction again. The waiter hurried away to the terminal. The conversation at the table faltered slightly. The wealthy women exchanged subtle, uncomfortable glances. The absolute worst social crime in their elite circle was an embarrassing financial public failure. Heather forced a bright, tight smile and offered a dismissive laugh. She blamed the delay on the archaic fraud protection algorithms of her wealth management firm. The head waiter returned 3 minutes later. His face was entirely pale. He informed Heather that the second card was also violently declined. The bank had actively returned a severe error code indicating a complete account freeze. Heather felt a cold, heavy stone drop directly into the bottom of her stomach. She ripped her wallet open and pulled out 3 distinct corporate cards. She slammed them onto the white tablecloth. She demanded the waiter run every single piece of plastic until the bill was completely settled. The waiter gathered the cards with trembling hands and rushed back to the machine. The elite women sitting around the table were now completely silent. The head waiter returned accompanied by the senior general manager of the country club. The manager carried the entire stack of credit cards. He placed them gently onto the table. He spoke in a low, extremely serious voice. He informed Heather that every single financial account associated with her name had been permanently locked by federal order. He stated the automated terminal had displayed a direct warning to confiscate the plastic cards immediately. Heather completely lost control of her meticulously crafted social facade. The thin veneer of high society elegance shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped up from her chair and knocked her crystal champagne flute onto the carpet. She screamed at the manager with absolute terrifying ferocity. She accused the club of utilizing defective equipment and threatened to destroy the establishment with massive, devastating lawsuits. She yelled that she was a multimillionaire and demanded absolute immediate respect. The entire dining room fell silent. Dozens of wealthy patrons turned to watch the horrific public spectacle. The elite women at Heather's table physically leaned away from her. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Heather was destroying her own reputation with every hysterical, screaming word. She was entirely oblivious to the impending disaster. The heavy oak doors swung open with a loud crack. Gregory strode confidently into the room. My attorney wore an immaculate suit and carried a leather briefcase. He was flanked by 2 federal marshals wearing tactical body armor. The marshals marched across the carpet toward the chaotic scene. Heather froze mid-scream, the color completely drained from her face. Gregory stopped a few feet away and looked at her with absolute contempt. He spoke in a loud voice that echoed off the chandeliers. He announced that he was legally representing my estate and officially executing a federal mandate. He declared that Heather was no longer authorized to access a single penny of my wealth. One of the federal marshals stepped forward and grabbed Heather by her wrist. He loudly announced an arrest warrant for attempted murder and domestic terrorism. He forcefully twisted her arms behind her back and locked steel handcuffs around her wrists. The elite members watched in absolute silence as she was dragged out into the rain. The federal courthouse projected an atmosphere of absolute authority. Aaron and Heather sat at the defense table. They were stripped of their designer clothing and forced into bright orange prison jumpsuits. Heavy steel chains bound their wrists and ankles. The harsh fluorescent lighting washed out Heather's remaining traces of glamour. Aaron sat slumped in his wooden chair with a posture of defeated exhaustion. They had spent 2 days separated in maximum security cells. The prosecutors outlined the mountain of irrefutable evidence against them. They faced federal indictments for domestic terrorism, attempted murder, financial fraud, and forgery. The sheer weight of the impending life sentences hung over the defense table. They refused to look at one another. Their unified front completely evaporated. The judge took her seat behind the mahogany bench and called the arraignment hearing to order. The lead prosecutor read the preliminary charges into the official record. He detailed the dark web transactions, the acquisition of the cardiovascular toxin, and the forged power of attorney. The horrific reality of their actions echoed loudly through the courtroom. Heather could no longer maintain her silence. The sheer terror of spending her life in a federal penitentiary broke her completely. She stood up abruptly. The heavy steel chains around her ankles rattled loudly. She addressed the judge directly with a trembling, theatrical voice. She executed a desperate final performance. Heather pointed a shaking finger directly at Aaron. She loudly proclaimed her absolute innocence. She stated Aaron was a violent, manipulative sociopath who completely controlled her life. She claimed she was entirely terrified of him and only followed his directives under severe psychological duress. She swore to the court that Aaron orchestrated the entire assassination plot to steal the family trust. She insisted he forced her to navigate the dark web and purchase the lethal cardiac toxin. She pleaded for leniency and offered full state testimony against her husband in exchange for immediate immunity. Aaron erupted in blind fury. He leaped out of his chair and lunged toward Heather. The marshals instantly forced him back into his seat. Aaron screamed loudly. He violently rejected her fabricated narrative. He shouted that Heather was the undeniable architect of the entire conspiracy. He told the judge that she researched the poison and personally administered the lethal dosage into the morning coffee. He screamed that she was a ruthless monster who manipulated his vulnerabilities to eliminate his father. He offered to surrender every piece of digital evidence proving her direct involvement. They viciously tore each other apart in the middle of the courtroom. Their mutual betrayal exposed the hollow core of their marriage. They possessed no loyalty. They possessed no honor. They were simply cowards trying to sacrifice one another to escape the consequences of their own actions. The judge banged her heavy wooden gavel repeatedly against the sounding block. She demanded immediate order in her courtroom. She threatened to hold them both in direct contempt if they uttered another word. The screaming match abruptly ceased. The heavy double doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. The sound drew the immediate attention of the entire gallery. The marshals stepped aside. I walked confidently through the wooden doorway and stepped onto the center aisle carpet. I was not lying in a hospital intensive care unit. I was not connected to life support machines. I was not trapped in a medical coma. I was wearing an impeccably tailored dark charcoal suit. My posture was perfectly straight. My stride was commanding. I looked healthy and undeniably alive. I walked down the center aisle toward the prosecution table. Aaron and Heather turned their heads simultaneously. They stared at me in absolute paralysis. The breath completely vanished from their lungs. Their eyes widened in profound horror. They were looking at a ghost. They firmly believed the synthetic digitalis had successfully destroyed my cardiovascular system. They rejoiced in the hospital room while mocking my supposedly impending death. The realization of their colossal failure crashed down upon them. They understood instantly that the medical coma was a highly calculated deception. They realized the hospital scenario was a sophisticated theater designed to lower their defenses and force them into making fatal strategic errors. I had personally orchestrated every phase of their destruction. I stopped directly behind the prosecution table. I looked at Aaron and Heather with a cold, unforgiving stare. I did not speak a single word. My silent presence in the courtroom was the ultimate devastating blow to their shattered reality. The judge adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the preliminary bail recommendations submitted by the prosecution. She looked down at Heather with a stern, uncompromising expression. The judge noted the irrefutable evidence linking Heather directly to the acquisition of the lethal synthetic toxin. She cited the extreme premeditated nature of the assassination plot and the hidden financial resources discovered in her secondary offshore accounts. The judge declared Heather an extreme flight risk and a clear and present danger to the community. She struck her gavel firmly against the wooden block. She officially denied bail in its entirety. Heather collapsed into her wooden chair. She began to weep uncontrollably. Her extravagant high society dreams were permanently replaced by the brutal reality of a concrete federal prison cell. She would not see the outside of a maximum security facility until her official murder trial. The judge turned her attention to Aaron. The prosecution team had strategically submitted a highly unorthodox recommendation regarding his pretrial detention. The judge read the document and nodded slowly. She acknowledged his direct involvement in the financial fraud and the bank vault infiltration. However, she noted his secondary role in the physical procurement of the poison. The judge granted Aaron temporary pretrial release. The bail was set at a massive, exorbitant amount secured entirely by a commercial bail bondsman. The release came with severe, strict restrictions. The marshals stepped forward and secured a heavy black GPS tracking monitor directly around his left ankle. He was strictly confined to a monitored halfway house on the outer edge of the industrial district. He was forbidden from accessing any electronic communication devices or leaving the county perimeter. Aaron stood up from the defense table. The heavy tracking monitor clamped tightly against his skin. He looked down at the black plastic device. A faint, arrogant smirk briefly touched the corners of his mouth. He incorrectly assumed the federal justice system had demonstrated a critical weakness. He firmly believed the release provided a narrow window of opportunity to bypass the electronic surveillance and permanently flee the jurisdiction. He calculated he possessed enough hidden street contacts to secure a forged passport and arrange a clandestine extraction. He looked at me one final time before the marshals escorted him outside. He believed he had a chance to escape the consequences of his betrayal. He was absolutely wrong. The electronic ankle monitor was not a simple federal tracking device. It was the final critical component of my strategy. I wanted him out of the secure federal holding facility. I needed him operating in the open industrial district. The lion was not simply alive today. The silent lion was actively hunting now. The heavy black plastic of the federal GPS tracking monitor rubbed painfully against Aaron's left ankle with every desperate step he took. He navigated the shadowy corridors of his upscale downtown apartment complex with frantic urgency. The commercial bail bondsman had strictly ordered him to report directly to the industrial district halfway house. Aaron had absolutely no intention of following those federal directives. He believed his superior intellect provided a guaranteed pathway to absolute freedom. He pushed the heavy oak door of his luxury apartment open and quickly locked the deadbolt behind him. The familiar scent of expensive leather and polished wood offered a fleeting false sense of ultimate security. He sprinted directly into the master bedroom. He dragged a large canvas duffel bag from the top shelf of his custom closet and threw it violently onto the king mattress. He ripped open his dresser drawers and blindly shoved stacks of designer clothing into the dark canvas compartment. He did not care about neatness or organization. He only cared about immediate distance. He dropped to his knees and pulled back the corner of the Persian rug. He unlocked a hidden floor safe and extracted his ultimate contingency plan. He pulled out a thick envelope containing $50,000 in untraceable cash and a perfectly forged Canadian passport. He looked at the fake identification document and smiled with profound arrogance. He intended to sever the tracking monitor with an industrial saw, abandon his vehicle at the local bus terminal, and disappear across the northern border before midnight. He laughed aloud at the thought of Heather rotting inside a maximum security penitentiary cell. He considered her a pathetic casualty of his superior strategic vision. He zipped the duffel bag shut and hoisted the heavy canvas strap over his right shoulder. He walked confidently back into the expansive living room to grab his keys. His confident stride abruptly halted. The false sense of absolute security instantly evaporated from his lungs. 3 incredibly large men were sitting silently in his expensive Italian leather chairs. The living room was entirely dark except for the ambient amber light filtering through the large glass windows. The man seated directly in the center was Silas. Silas was the ruthless operational enforcer for the violent underground syndicate that controlled Aaron's massive gambling debts. He wore a sharp black suit that strained against his massive muscular frame. He casually swirled a crystal glass of Aaron's most expensive scotch. The two heavily armed enforcers standing beside him stared at Aaron with completely dead, uncompromising eyes. Aaron felt a cold, heavy stone of pure terror drop directly into the bottom of his stomach. The canvas duffel bag slipped off his shoulder and hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. He tried to force a confident, welcoming smile, but his facial muscles completely refused to cooperate. Silas took a slow, deliberate sip of the amber liquid. He placed the crystal glass onto the glass coffee table with a sharp clink. He reached inside his tailored jacket and extracted a neatly folded legal document. Silas tossed the heavy parchment paper across the table. It landed directly at Aaron's trembling feet. It was the certified property deed Aaron had utilized as primary collateral to secure a massive extension on his gambling markers. Silas spoke in a low, terrifyingly calm voice. He explained that his syndicate employed highly specialized forensic accountants to verify all major asset transfers. He informed Aaron that their internal experts had rigorously examined the property deed that morning. The forensic team completely dismantled the illusion. The legal document was an absolute sophisticated forgery. The digital seals were fake. The municipal signatures were entirely fabricated. The collateral Aaron had used to guarantee his life was mathematically worthless. Aaron began to stammer uncontrollably. He desperately attempted to construct a plausible defensive narrative. He claimed the bank had made a catastrophic administrative error. He swore he could access genuine liquidity by the end of the week. He promised to double the interest payments if Silas simply granted him a temporary extension. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the pathetic lies spilling from Aaron's mouth. Silas simply nodded his head once toward the two silent enforcers. The violence exploded with terrifying, immediate velocity. The first enforcer lunged forward and delivered a devastating blow directly to Aaron's abdomen. Aaron collapsed forward, gasping violently for oxygen that his lungs could no longer process. The second enforcer grabbed Aaron by the collar of his designer shirt and hurled him brutally across the living room. Aaron crashed violently into the heavy glass coffee table. The thick tempered glass shattered into 1,000 jagged crystalline pieces. Aaron hit the hardwood floor amidst the sharp shattered debris. Intense, agonizing pain radiated through his entire body. He tried to crawl backward toward the front door. The first enforcer kicked him viciously in the ribs. The sound of cracking bone echoed loudly through the dark apartment. Aaron screamed in absolute agony. He curled into a tight defensive ball to protect his vital organs. The two massive men proceeded to systematically dismantle him. They delivered precise, calculated strikes designed to inflict maximum physical suffering without triggering immediate unconsciousness. Blood poured from Aaron's broken nose and lips. Metallic copper flooded his mouth. He gagged and choked on his own blood. The brutal assault lasted exactly 3 minutes. Silas slowly stood up from the leather chair. He walked over and stood directly above Aaron's broken, bleeding form. He raised his hand. The two enforcers immediately stopped their assault and stepped back into the shadows. Silas looked down with supreme, unadulterated disgust. He delivered the final, irrevocable ultimatum. He informed Aaron that the syndicate required exactly $500,000 in untraceable cash. He granted Aaron exactly 24 hours to produce the complete sum. Silas leaned down and whispered directly into Aaron's bleeding ear. He promised that if the money was not secured by the following evening, Aaron would never live long enough to see the inside of a federal prison cell. He guaranteed the syndicate would extract the payment through agonizing physical torture before disposing of his body in a location the authorities would never discover. Silas straightened his suit jacket. He walked calmly out of the apartment. The two enforcers followed silently behind him. They left the heavy oak door wide open. Aaron lay entirely paralyzed among the shattered glass and pooling blood. Every single breath sent jagged knives of pain tearing through his broken ribs. His vision swam with dark spots. He realized that his arrogant plans were completely destroyed. He desperately dragged his broken body across the cold hardwood floor, leaving a thick crimson trail behind him. He reached his trembling hand toward his shattered smartphone resting near the open doorway. He dialed his father's number. He sobbed openly and pathetically into the receiver. He begged George for his life. George listened to the frantic, desperate sobbing echoing through the digital connection. He stood completely motionless inside the quiet beachfront house. He replied with a cold, steady voice. "My protection does not extend to the man who tried to murder me." He hung up the phone. Aaron dropped the shattered smartphone onto the blood-stained hardwood floor. The dial tone echoed faintly in the silent apartment before the device finally powered down. He stared at the blank screen with absolute disbelief. His father had just condemned him to death with a single emotionless sentence. The reality of his complete isolation crashed over him. The brutal physical agony radiating from his shattered ribs was temporarily eclipsed by a wave of pure primal terror. Silas and his enforcers were not making an empty threat. The syndicate would return in exactly 23 hours to execute him slowly. Aaron dragged his broken body toward the leather sofa. He grabbed the heavy wooden leg and pulled himself up. He spat a mouthful of metallic blood onto the expensive Persian rug. He needed $500,000 in untraceable cash by tomorrow evening. He had absolutely zero financial resources. His offshore accounts were frozen by the federal mandate. His credit lines were permanently severed. His criminal associates had abandoned him the second the FBI raided the bank vault. He possessed only one remaining piece of leverage. He possessed a single target that George valued above his own life. Aaron limped into the master bathroom and splashed freezing water onto his bruised face. He stared at his swollen eyes in the vanity mirror. He actively justified the monstrous decision he was about to make. He convinced himself that George was the true villain of this narrative. He believed his father had forced his hand by withholding the family fortune. Aaron decided to kidnap his own daughter. He intended to hold Mia for a massive ransom. He calculated that George would instantly liquidate his hidden assets to ensure his granddaughter remained safe. Aaron grabbed a heavy black hooded sweatshirt from the closet to conceal his bloody shirt. He swallowed a handful of over-the-counter painkillers to dull the agonizing throbbing in his chest. He pulled a dark baseball cap low over his forehead. He checked his heavy black GPS ankle monitor. The commercial bail bondsman had restricted him to the industrial district halfway house, but he had not technically breached the perimeter yet. He knew stepping near the elementary school would instantly trigger a proximity violation. He did not care. He only needed 30 minutes to grab the child and disappear into the city underground. He sneaked down the rear fire escape of the luxury apartment building to avoid the lobby's security cameras. He stole a heavy iron crowbar from a maintenance closet and smashed the driver window of an old utility van parked in the alleyway. He hot-wired the ignition with trembling, bloody fingers. The engine roared to life. Aaron threw the transmission into gear and sped aggressively toward the coastal suburbs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban streets. He navigated the residential roads with frantic, erratic precision. He parked the stolen utility van 2 blocks away from Oak Creek Elementary School. He turned off the engine and watched the digital clock on the dashboard. The final school bell was scheduled to ring in exactly 14 minutes. Aaron gripped the steering wheel so tightly his bruised knuckles turned completely white. He ignored the shooting pain in his fractured ribs. He focused entirely on the desperate extraction plan. He intended to intercept Mia before she boarded the county transit bus. He would force her into the back of the van and immediately transmit a ransom video to the secure email server. The loud electronic bell echoed across the sprawling school campus. Hundreds of children poured out of the double glass doors and flooded the concrete courtyard. Yellow school buses lined the main thoroughfare. Aaron stepped out of the stolen van. He pulled the dark hood over his head and kept his face angled toward the pavement. He walked rapidly toward the designated student pickup zone. He scanned the chaotic crowd of screaming children and exhausted teachers. He spotted Mia instantly. She was walking alone toward the Eastern Transit stop. She wore a bright yellow raincoat and carried a heavy canvas backpack. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of the massive brick building. Aaron felt a brief fleeting surge of parental guilt. He instantly crushed the emotion and replaced it with absolute selfish survival instinct. He accelerated his pace and intercepted her directly behind a large oak tree near the edge of the staff parking lot. Aaron stepped out from the shadows and blocked her path. Mia stopped abruptly. She looked up at the battered, bleeding face of her father. She did not display a single ounce of fear or surprise. Her young eyes were completely cold and resolute. Aaron reached out and grabbed her small wrist with his heavy hand. He squeezed her arm tightly and ordered her to remain completely silent. He told her they were leaving immediately. He fabricated a frantic lie about a family emergency. He claimed George had suffered a fatal medical complication and they needed to rush directly to the hospital. Aaron attempted to drag her toward the hidden utility van. He vastly underestimated the young girl George had actively trained and protected. Mia did not scream initially. She planted her feet firmly onto the wet pavement and threw her weight backward. She refused to move a single inch. She looked directly into the panicked eyes of her father. She told him calmly that she knew he was lying. She stated George was perfectly healthy and waiting for her at the beachfront house. Aaron lost his remaining patience. He cursed aggressively and lunged forward to physically lift her off the ground. Mia immediately engaged the tactical protocol George had taught her. She reached her free hand across her body and aggressively pressed the thick red panic button embedded on the side of her waterproof smartwatch. The sophisticated military-grade device instantly transmitted a silent priority distress signal directly to the local police department and the school administration office. Mia did not wait for the authorities to arrive. She utilized her own physical agency. She opened her mouth and unleashed a deafening, piercing scream that echoed violently across the entire school campus. She yelled that a stranger was attempting to kidnap her. She dropped her heavy canvas backpack directly onto the injured foot of her attacker. Aaron gasped in sudden pain and briefly loosened his grip. Mia ripped her wrist free and sprinted backward toward the crowded courtyard. Aaron panicked completely. He lunged forward to grab her yellow raincoat. He never reached her. 2 massive school security guards heard the piercing scream and charged across the asphalt. They tackled Aaron simultaneously from the side. The sheer kinetic force of the impact drove Aaron violently into the hard pavement. His fractured ribs cracked audibly against the concrete. He screamed in pure, blinding agony. The guards pinned his arms aggressively behind his back and pushed his face against the wet gravel. Aaron tasted blood and dirt. He struggled pathetically against their immense weight. He realized his final, desperate contingency plan had failed spectacularly. The black ankle monitor emitted a loud tone. Armed police swarmed the elementary school. His final desperate act guaranteed he would never escape prison. The oak doors swung shut, sealing the fate of the two individuals at the defense table. Aaron and Heather sat inches apart, but a massive chasm of hatred divided them. Aaron wore a bright orange security jumpsuit. His fractured ribs were a direct consequence of his failed kidnapping attempt and his encounter with the syndicate. Heather wore an identical orange uniform. Her posture was slumped. She stared at the mahogany table. The criminal trial commenced on a cold Tuesday morning. The prosecution spent days outlining the facts of the assassination plot and the forged power of attorney. The burden of proof shifted entirely to the defense. Heather hired an aggressive attorney known for theatrical manipulations. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly toward the jury box. He buttoned his suit jacket and projected sympathetic sorrow. He began his opening argument by abandoning any claim of factual innocence. He knew the digital and financial evidence was insurmountable. He pivoted to an emotional narrative of psychological abuse. He painted Heather as a vulnerable woman trapped in a toxic environment. He pointed toward the gallery where I was sitting. He accused me of being a tyrannical patriarch who utilized my wealth to torture my family. He claimed I held my wealth over them like a weapon. He stated I dictated their lives and humiliated Heather at every opportunity. He told the jury his client was pushed to a mental breaking point. He argued the acquisition of the lethal toxin was an act of pure survival. He painted Aaron as an oppressed victim who snapped under my expectations. The defense attorney paced back and forth across the floor. He leaned against the wooden rail of the jury box and lowered his voice to a whisper. He pleaded with the citizens to understand the distress that drove this couple to madness. He claimed the real crime was the decade of financial and emotional subjugation they suffered under my roof. He concluded his theatrical speech by asking the jury for leniency and understanding. He wiped a tear from his eye and walked back to the defense table. He sat down next to Heather. She placed her hands over her face and began to weep loudly. It was a performance designed to inject doubt and secure a reduced charge. The lead prosecutor immediately stood up and called his final witness to the stand. He called my name. The entire courtroom fell silent. I stood up from the gallery and walked toward the front. I wore a tailored charcoal suit. I did not glare at Aaron or Heather. I did not project anger. I walked with the pace of a man who had survived the worst. I placed my right hand on the Bible and swore to tell the complete truth. I sat down in the witness chair and adjusted the microphone. The prosecutor asked me to state my name for the official record. I stated my name in a clear voice. The prosecutor asked me to describe my relationship with my son and his wife over the past decade. I did not launch into an emotional tirade. I simply presented the cold, verifiable facts. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick-bound ledger. I handed the document directly to the court bailiff, who passed it to the judge. I explained that the ledger contained a meticulous accounting of every single financial transaction I had executed on behalf of Aaron and Heather over the past 10 years. I listed the massive down payment I provided for their luxury home. I detailed the unnecessary sports cars I purchased for their anniversaries. I documented the hundreds of thousands of dollars I transferred to cover Aaron's mounting gambling debts and Heather's exorbitant shopping habits. I spoke with calm, steady precision. The sheer volume of my financial generosity destroyed the defense attorney's narrative of tyrannical oppression. The jury listened very intently. Their expressions shifted from sympathetic curiosity to cold skepticism. The prosecutor then transitioned to the events leading up to the poisoning. He asked me to confirm the installation of hidden security devices inside my beachfront property. I confirmed that I had placed discrete audio and visual recorders in the primary living areas after noticing several missing high-value items. I explained that I initially suspected a hired cleaning service, but the reality was far more devastating. The prosecutor walked over to the multimedia cart and pressed a button on a small remote control. The large flat-screen monitor mounted on the courtroom wall flickered to life. A crisp, clear audio recording began to play through the overhead speakers. The entire courtroom heard Heather's voice echoing loudly. The recording captured her standing in my kitchen just days before I collapsed. She was complaining bitterly to Aaron about my prolonged survival. She stated I was taking entirely too long to die naturally. She complained about the inconvenience of my presence and her burning desire to secure the offshore accounts immediately. The audio captured the distinct sound of glass clinking against ceramic. The recording caught Aaron asking if she was measuring the dosage correctly. Heather laughed coldly in the audio track. She confidently stated the synthetic toxin was completely untraceable and that the elevated dosage would simulate a massive, unrecoverable heart attack. The jury heard her casually discuss my impending murder while physically transferring the deadly poison directly into my morning coffee blend. The absolute callousness of her tone was completely chilling. It was not the voice of a fragile, terrified woman pushed to the brink of madness. It was the voice of a cold, calculating predator executing a flawless assassination for pure financial gain. The audio recording ended with a sharp click. The silence that followed was suffocating. Heather stopped her weeping immediately. She stared at the monitor with absolute horror. Aaron slumped forward until his forehead rested against the table. The defense attorney lowered his head into his hands. He realized his emotional narrative was incinerated. He had built a house of cards, and I had crushed it with undeniable truth. The lead prosecutor turned to the defense attorney and offered him the opportunity to cross-examine the witness. The defense attorney stood up slowly. He looked at the jury. He looked at the staggering mountain of financial ledgers. He looked at the blank screen that had just broadcast his client's absolute guilt. He shook his head defeatedly. He stated he had no questions for this witness. He sat down heavily in his leather chair. The fight was completely drained from his body. The 12 jury members turned their collective gaze toward the defense table. They looked at Aaron and Heather with pure, unadulterated disgust. There was no sympathy left in the room. There was no lingering doubt regarding their motivations. The overwhelming evidence of their greed and malice was permanently etched into the official record. I stepped down from the witness stand and walked slowly back to my seat in the gallery. I did not ever look back at them. The judge gathered her paperwork and adjusted her heavy black robes. She looked across the silent courtroom. She prepared to deliver the final absolute verdict. The heavy gavel struck the sounding block with the finality of a closing tomb. Judge Miller surveyed the sprawling courtroom. Everyone focused their attention on the raised mahogany bench. The jury foreman had already delivered the unanimous guilty verdicts regarding all criminal charges. The rapid deliberation confirmed the lack of sympathy. Aaron and Heather stood beside their defeated legal counsel. Their bright orange jumpsuits contrasted with the polished wood of the courtroom. They trembled visibly. The crushing weight of their impending doom shattered their arrogant delusions. Judge Miller adjusted her reading glasses and looked directly at Heather. The judge spoke with a voice devoid of human compassion. She stated the court recognized the chilling malice required to plan the murder of a family member for financial gain. She referenced the digital audio recording. She noted the terrifying casualness with which Heather handled the toxin. The judge declared Heather a danger to society and a remorseless predator. She delivered the sentence with clinical precision. Heather was sentenced to 15 years inside a maximum security federal penitentiary. The sentence carried an absolute mandate prohibiting early parole. Heather collapsed instantly. Her knees buckled violently beneath her. The marshals caught her underneath her arms and hauled her back to her feet. She gasped for air as if drowning. The judge turned her gaze toward Aaron. She dismantled his cowardly attempts to shift the blame onto his wife. She highlighted his enthusiastic participation in the financial forgery and his monstrous attempt to kidnap his daughter. She condemned him for betraying the father who funded his existence. The judge sentenced Aaron to 12 years in federal prison. The chains rattled as Aaron swayed on his feet. The reality of spending a decade inside a concrete cell paralyzed his cognitive functions. The courtroom remained completely silent. The spectators watched the absolute destruction of two irredeemable individuals. The legal proceedings officially concluded. The marshals stepped forward to secure the prisoners for transport to the holding facility. The movement snapped Aaron out of his shock. He looked frantically across the wooden barrier. He locked eyes with me in the front row of the gallery. Desperate panic washed over his bruised face. Aaron lunged toward the wooden railing. The heavy steel chains bit deeply into his wrists. The marshals yanked him backward, but he fought frantically against their grip. He screamed my name loudly across the room. He begged for immediate mercy. He cried hysterically. He claimed he was completely lost and confused. He swore he never wanted me to die. He promised to spend the rest of his natural life making amends for his sins. He pleaded with me to speak to the judge and demand leniency. He degraded himself entirely in front of the gallery. Heather witnessed his display and immediately joined the chaotic spectacle. She pushed against the marshal holding her arm. She shrieked my name through her sobbing. She begged for a second chance. She claimed she was broken and needed psychological help rather than a prison cell. She promised to walk away from the estate forever. She pleaded for mercy on behalf of her daughter. She utilized Mia as a final desperate bargaining chip. They screamed over one another. They competed to present the most pathetic display of absolute submission. Their frantic voices echoed off the high vaulted ceiling. The spectators watched the humiliating spectacle with intense physical revulsion. Their performative grief held zero remorse. They were entirely sorry they had been caught. They mourned the loss of their luxury lifestyle and their impending incarceration. They did not mourn the permanent destruction of our family. I stood up from the wooden bench. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored charcoal suit. I walked toward the barrier separating the gallery from the defense. The marshals tightened their grip on the struggling prisoners but allowed me to approach. Aaron and Heather instantly stopped screaming. They stared at me with wide, terrified eyes. They held their breath in anticipation. They hoped my approach signaled a sudden wave of paternal forgiveness. They believed my inherent kindness would override my desire for absolute justice. I stopped in front of the railing. I looked down at them. I did not feel a single ounce of anger. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional void was completely liberating. I spoke in a steady voice that carried across the silent room. I told them their apologies were mathematically worthless. I stated their tears held the exact same value as the love they had pretended to possess for 10 years. I reminded them they had celebrated my impending death over a cup of poisoned coffee. I informed them they were no longer my family. They were simply convicted felons facing the absolute consequences of their own arrogance. I looked directly into Aaron's panicked eyes. I told him he was no longer my son. I stated he was a stranger who happened to share my last name. Aaron let out a guttural wail. He dropped to his knees. The chains slammed against the polished floor. I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom with a confident stride. Aaron screamed my name repeatedly. He begged me to turn around. He pleaded for one final look. I ignored his frantic cries. I pushed open the double doors and stepped out into the lit corridor. I did not look back a single time. The cool air of the courthouse corridor washed over me. I took a deep breath. The suffocating weight of the trial was officially lifted from my shoulders. The threat against my life was permanently neutralized. I walked toward the main exit with a profound sense of absolute peace. Gregory stepped out of a consultation room and intercepted me near the elevators. My attorney carried a thick manila folder. His facial expression was incredibly rigid. The professional victory had not relaxed his demeanor. Gregory pulled me into a quiet alcove away from the reporters. He spoke in a rapid whisper. The legal battle regarding the attempted murder was now successfully concluded. However, a massive secondary threat had emerged from the criminal underworld. Gregory opened the folder and presented a certified copy of a legal document. It was a promissory note. Aaron had forged my signature on a corporate document to secure his extension with Silas and the gambling syndicate. Aaron had pledged the total liquid assets of my primary commercial trust to guarantee his life. The syndicate was fully aware Aaron was heading to federal prison. They were actively shifting their focus. Silas had retained a team of aggressive civil litigators. They were preparing to file a massive civil suit against my estate. They intended to forcefully collect the $500,000 using the fraudulent document. They threatened to tie my businesses in endless litigation until I surrendered the funds. The syndicate believed I would simply pay the ransom to avoid public scrutiny. They severely miscalculated my resolve. I had just dismantled my own son for his betrayal. I refused to surrender a single penny to a violent street syndicate. I instructed Gregory to prepare the financial ledgers. I needed to sever this infected root immediately. The morning sun reflected brilliantly off the gentle waves of the Atlantic Ocean. George stood by the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of his beachfront home. He held a ceramic mug of freshly brewed black coffee. The dark liquid offered a bitter, comforting warmth. The massive legal victory in the federal courthouse had effectively neutralized his immediate family. Aaron and Heather were currently sitting inside maximum security prison cells. Their extravagant ambitions were permanently reduced to concrete walls and metal bars. George felt a profound sense of absolute tranquility. The oppressive weight of their endless greed was entirely lifted from his weary shoulders. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark coffee. He watched a solitary seagull dive toward the sparkling water. The serene atmosphere was abruptly interrupted by the heavy crunch of gravel in his private circular driveway. A sleek, black luxury sedan parked directly in front of the main entrance. The vehicle did not belong to a friend or a friendly neighbor. It projected an immediate aura of quiet, aggressive hostility. Gregory stood quietly near the kitchen island. The sharp attorney had arrived an hour earlier to finalize the estate restructuring documents. Gregory looked out the window and his professional demeanor instantly hardened. He recognized the specific make and model of the vehicle. Two large men wearing dark tailored suits stepped out of the front doors. They scanned the perimeter with the cold, detached efficiency of professional enforcers. A third man emerged from the rear passenger seat. He wore a highly expensive gray suit and carried a slim leather briefcase. His posture screamed of corporate arrogance mixed with violent underworld authority. This was the syndicate lawyer. He represented the ruthless loan shark who held Aaron's massive fraudulent debt. Silas had sent his absolute best legal predator to collect the $500,000. The syndicate operated on a strict policy of absolute collection. They erroneously believed George would easily surrender the money to protect his family name and avoid a violent confrontation. They severely miscalculated the specific type of man they were dealing with today. A loud, heavy knock echoed through the quiet beachfront house. George did not flinch. He placed his ceramic coffee mug onto the polished granite countertop. He walked calmly toward the heavy oak front door. Gregory followed closely behind him, holding a thick manila folder. George opened the door wide. The cold ocean breeze swept into the foyer. The syndicate lawyer stood on the welcome mat with a predatory smile. He introduced himself smoothly as Mr. Vance. He claimed to represent a highly motivated consortium of private investors. He did not wait for an invitation. He stepped aggressively over the threshold and walked directly into the center of the living room. The two massive enforcers remained standing silently on the front porch. They crossed their muscular arms and stared directly at George. The physical intimidation tactics were blatantly obvious. Mr. Vance placed his slim leather briefcase onto the glass coffee table. He snapped the golden latches open with a sharp metallic click. He extracted a thick stack of legal documents and spread them deliberately across the smooth glass surface. Mr. Vance spoke in a low, dangerously smooth voice. He explained that Aaron had secured a massive financial extension using this very property as the primary collateral. He pointed directly to a specific document containing a signature that looked remarkably similar to George's handwriting. He stated the debt was immediately due and payable in full. He demanded a direct wire transfer of $500,000 by the end of the business day. He leaned forward and dropped his polite corporate facade. He threatened to place an immediate aggressive lien on the beachfront house. He claimed his consortium would tie the estate up in endless suffocating litigation. He promised to freeze every single liquid asset George possessed. He then lowered his voice to a menacing whisper. He offered a heavily veiled threat regarding George's physical safety. He casually mentioned that beachfront properties were unfortunately highly isolated. He noted that emergency services often took a considerable amount of time to respond to distress calls in this specific affluent neighborhood. He suggested that paying the $500,000 was a very small price to guarantee a long, peaceful, and uninterrupted retirement. George listened to the entire extortion pitch in absolute silence. He did not show a single trace of fear. He did not break eye contact with the arrogant lawyer. He simply observed the man with cold, clinical detachment. George had just dismantled his own son and daughter-in-law without shedding a single tear. He had navigated a sophisticated assassination attempt and orchestrated a flawless federal trap. The veiled threats of a street-level syndicate completely failed to register on his emotional spectrum. George looked at the forged promissory note resting on the glass table. He recognized Aaron's desperate, pathetic handwriting instantly. He felt a brief flash of utter disgust for the cowardice of his imprisoned son. Aaron had genuinely tried to sell his father's sanctuary to a group of violent criminals to save his own miserable life. George slowly shifted his gaze back to Mr. Vance. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded his head once toward his attorney. Gregory stepped forward with absolute professional authority. He completely ignored the forged documents on the coffee table. He opened his thick manila folder and extracted a certified federal court ruling. He handed the heavy document directly to Mr. Vance. The syndicate lawyer took the paper with a confused frown. He scanned the dense legal text. His predatory smile completely vanished. Gregory spoke with a voice like sharpened steel. He officially informed Mr. Vance that the signature on the collateral document was mathematically and legally proven to be a complete forgery. He cited the specific federal trial transcripts where Aaron's massive financial deception was meticulously documented and entered into the permanent government record. He explained that the federal judge had already ruled the promissory note entirely void and legally unenforceable. The document Mr. Vance was using for extortion was absolutely worthless. It was nothing more than a piece of trash generated by a desperate convicted felon. Mr. Vance stared silently at the federal seal on the court ruling. The color slowly drained from his shocked face. Gregory stepped closer to the syndicate lawyer and delivered the final, absolute ultimatum. He informed Mr. Vance that George possessed immense, untraceable offshore wealth. He clearly stated that if the syndicate ever contacted George again, George would personally fund a massive, relentless federal RICO investigation against their entire organization. Gregory promised to hire the most ruthless private intelligence firms operating globally today. He swore to map out every single illegal operation and hand the comprehensive dossier directly to the FBI. Mr. Vance looked up and stared directly into George's cold, unblinking eyes. The lawyer realized he was dealing with an apex predator who had just destroyed his own family without flinching even once. The entire syndicate was completely and utterly outmatched. Mr. Vance quickly gathered his absolutely worthless papers, turned, and fled the beautiful beachfront house instantly. The final dangerous threat was permanently and entirely eradicated for good. The quiet inside the beachfront house was entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of impending betrayal. It was the hollow, fragile quiet of survival. George stood in the hallway and watched his granddaughter through the crack in the bedroom door. Mia sat on the edge of her mattress, staring blankly at the wall. She had barely spoken a complete sentence since the chaotic afternoon in the elementary school parking lot. The physical bruises on her wrist from Aaron's violent grip had faded to a dull yellow, but the psychological scars were completely raw. She refused to eat meals. She suffered from severe night terrors. George often woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of her muffled sobbing. He would find her curled into a tight defensive ball at the foot of her bed. She lived in a state of hypervigilance. She constantly watched the windows and monitored the security cameras. The absolute monstrous betrayal of her own parents had entirely shattered her fundamental understanding of human trust. She expected every adult in her life to eventually manipulate her or abandon her. She waited for George to drop his protective facade and reveal a hidden selfish motive. George refused to offer her empty platitudes. He knew that whispering sweet fabricated promises would only deepen her profound suspicions. He did not tell her that everything was fine or that the bad memories would simply vanish with time. He respected her intelligence entirely too much to lie to her. He understood that she needed a very tangible foundation to ground her completely shattered reality. She needed physical proof that the world still contained solid, immutable objects. He walked directly into her bedroom and told her to put on a pair of heavy denim jeans and an old cotton shirt. Mia followed him silently out the back door and across the paved driveway. The salty ocean breeze whipped her hair across her pale face. George unlocked the heavy reinforced steel door of his detached workshop. He flipped a heavy electrical switch on the concrete wall. 2 rows of bright fluorescent lights flickered to life. They illuminated the massive space. The air smelled sharply of motor oil and metallic dust. In the absolute center of the concrete floor sat his vintage pickup truck. The vehicle was a massive, heavy, hulking mass of solid American steel that had sat dormant for several years. George walked over to the front of the truck and released the heavy metal hood. He propped it open to reveal the complex, tangled machinery of the dormant engine. He walked over to a tall, red metal tool chest and pulled open the top drawer. He extracted a heavy silver wrench and walked back to the vehicle. He held the heavy, cold metal tool out directly toward his granddaughter. Mia stared at the wrench with absolute hesitation. She did not understand what he was asking her to do. George instructed her to take the tool and step up to the bumper. She slowly took the heavy wrench from his hand. The weight of the solid steel grounded her instantly. George did not offer a gentle, comforting lecture. He pointed directly to a rusted bolt securing the alternator bracket. He told her to place the wrench over the hexagonal metal head and pull with her entire body weight. Mia stepped onto a small wooden stool and positioned the tool exactly as instructed. She pulled backward with maximum effort. The rusted bolt refused to yield. She looked at George with a frustrated, defeated expression. She expected him to simply take the wrench away. George did not intervene. He told her that rusted metal required absolute stubborn persistence. He instructed her to adjust her grip and utilize the mechanical leverage of the steel handle. Mia set her jaw and leaned back with all her remaining strength. The rusted steel bolt snapped loose with a very loud, sharp crack. The sudden release of tension sent her stumbling backward. She caught her balance and looked down at the removed piece of hardware. George handed her a rag and told her to wipe the accumulated grime from the exposed threading. The mechanical work had officially begun. They worked together in complete silence for the next 2 hours. George guided her hands through the dense labyrinth of the engine bay. They removed spark plugs and disconnected heavy rubber hoses. They drained the dark, sludgy motor oil into a large plastic pan. George used the mechanical components to deliver a brutal, honest lesson about reality. He explained that an engine was a system of absolute accountability. Every single part relied entirely on the surrounding components to function. He told her that when a single gear failed, the entire machine stopped moving forward. There were no hidden intentions. He calmly explained that humans were inherently flawed and incredibly fragile. He told her that her parents had allowed greed and cowardice to completely rot their internal systems. He explicitly stated that their monumental failure was not a reflection of her inherent value. Their betrayal was a mechanical failure of their own character. He told her that broken machines could be meticulously stripped down and rebuilt. He promised her that she possessed the internal fortitude to rebuild her own life. He emphasized that true strength never comes from relying blindly on other people to provide safety or emotional stability. He taught her that ultimate strength comes from absolute self-reliance. He wiped a streak of black grease from his forehead. He looked directly into her eyes and told her she must become her own primary protector. He promised to stand beside her and shield her from the immediate dangers of the world. However, he insisted she must learn to wield her own tools. He absolutely refused to raise a victim. He demanded she become an immovable force capable of navigating a cruel, unpredictable world. Mia listened to every single word with intense, unbreakable focus. The fear slowly dissolved. The sheer physical exertion of dismantling the heavy steel engine effectively drained the paralyzing anxiety from her small body. She stopped jumping at sudden noises. Her hands stopped trembling. She wiped her face with the back of her arm and smeared a thick line of black motor grease across her cheek. She looked down at her stained fingernails and the pile of extracted engine parts resting on the concrete floor. A profound realization washed over her. She recognized the undeniable truth in her grandfather's harsh mechanical philosophy. She finally understood that she was not a discarded, useless object. Mia looked up at George, standing beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He was covered in dirt and oil. He looked like an ancient, unyielding monument. She realized he was not a fragile old man waiting to be victimized. He was a ruthless, brilliant architect of his own survival. He was an immovable fortress of absolute discipline and unwavering resolve. For the very first time in months, the heavy shadows completely receded from her eyes. A genuine bright smile broke across her grease-stained face. She firmly picked up the heavy silver wrench again. She knew she was finally and entirely safe. The metallic clatter of heavy steel tools fading into the background marked a profound transition within the estate. The intense mechanical restoration inside the garage served its exact purpose. Mia had successfully internalized the brutal but necessary lessons regarding self-reliance and absolute accountability. The thick layers of black grease on her small hands represented her initiation into a reality where survival was actively forged rather than passively expected. Several days passed since their profound breakthrough beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the workshop. The coastal weather shifted into a brilliantly clear afternoon. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the pristine hardwood floors of the main living room. George sat in his oversized leather armchair. He felt a deep calm resonating within his bones. The frantic, chaotic energy that had infected his home for an entire decade was completely eradicated. The doorbell chimed with a soft, melodic tone. George stood up and walked toward the foyer. Gregory stood on the front porch holding his familiar leather briefcase. The sharp attorney stepped inside and removed his tailored suit jacket. He carried a demeanor of absolute finality. This specific visit was not prompted by an impending legal crisis or a violent threat from a street syndicate. This visit was designed to close the final remaining loop of the sprawling nightmare. Gregory walked over to the heavy oak dining table and extracted a large stack of freshly printed legal documents. He arranged the papers with his usual meticulous precision. He looked up at George with a rare expression of personal concern. Gregory cleared his throat and initiated the conversation. He stated that the federal incarceration of Aaron and Heather was proceeding without any complications. He confirmed that the syndicate had completely vanished into the criminal underworld after receiving the federal court documents. The immediate external threats were permanently neutralized. However, Gregory wanted to address a lingering psychological vulnerability. He gestured toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. He reminded George that this specific house was the exact staging ground for a calculated assassination plot. He noted that Heather had physically mixed synthetic toxins into his coffee within the adjacent kitchen. He pointed out that Aaron had conspired to steal the very walls surrounding them. Gregory gently suggested that maintaining the property might tether George to a continuous cycle of dark, traumatic memories. He formally proposed liquidating the beachfront estate entirely. He explained that the current real estate market would yield a massive financial return. He argued that selling the house would allow them to relocate to a neutral environment. They could purchase a new property devoid of toxic history and lingering shadows. Gregory pushed a preliminary real estate appraisal across the smooth wooden table. He stated that erasing the physical location of the betrayal was the most logical step toward achieving total closure. He offered to handle the entire listing process discreetly. He waited silently for George to absorb the practical advice. George did not look at the appraisal document. He looked around the spacious living room. He observed the structural beams and the solid foundation he had personally financed and maintained. He turned his piercing gaze back to his trusted attorney. George categorically refused the proposal. He spoke with absolute, unwavering conviction. He explained that selling the house would represent a fundamental concession to the people who tried to destroy him. It would mean allowing the failed ambitions of two convicted felons to dictate his geographical reality. Running away from a physical location surrenders power to the ghosts of the past. George refused to let Aaron and Heather claim any form of victory even in their absence. He declared that the house was not a monument to their treacherous betrayal. The estate was a towering testament to his own survival and total victory over their greed. The disease that had infected his home was surgically excised and securely locked inside a federal penitentiary. The remaining structure was completely clean. George reached across the table and pushed the real estate appraisal back toward Gregory. He demanded a different set of legal documents. He instructed Gregory to produce the irrevocable trust files. Gregory nodded with deep understanding. He extracted a thick blue folder and placed it directly in front of George. The document was a master deed of transfer. George picked up a heavy silver fountain pen. He did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He pressed the metal nib against the thick parchment and signed his name with bold strokes. He transferred the absolute ownership of the multi-million-dollar beachfront estate directly into a secure educational and living trust. The sole named beneficiary of the impenetrable trust was Mia. George legally ensured that his granddaughter possessed an absolute fortress of financial security. He structured the trust to prevent any external entity from compromising her future. He handed the executed documents back to Gregory. The attorney secured the papers inside his briefcase and offered a respectful bow of his head. The final administrative task was perfectly complete. His dignity remained entirely intact. Gregory departed the residence. George walked out the back doors and stepped onto the wide wooden porch of the Savannah house. The wooden planks felt solid and reassuring beneath his leather boots. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out endlessly before him. The tide was coming in. The salty mist carried the distinct, refreshing chill of the incoming evening breeze. The rhythmic crashing of the saltwater waves against the sandy shore provided a steady, powerful soundtrack to the closing day. The sky ignited with vibrant shades of deep crimson and bright orange. The sun began its slow descent below the watery horizon. George leaned against the sturdy wooden railing. He inhaled the sharp, clean scent of the ocean air. He looked down the private stretch of beach. Mia was running along the wet, packed sand. She was no longer hiding in the dark corners of a silent bedroom. She wore faded denim jeans and a simple cotton shirt. She chased the retreating waves with a burst of uninhibited energy. She stopped and bent down to inspect a smooth, white seashell resting on the shoreline. She held the shell up toward the fading sunlight. The small object caught the final radiant beams of the afternoon. Her hands were still slightly stained with the dark grease from the engine block. The mechanical grime was a permanent badge of her newly discovered resilience. She looked back toward the house and saw her grandfather standing on the elevated porch. She did not see a vulnerable elderly target. She saw an immovable fortress guarding her existence. Mia waved her hand in the air and smiled widely. A genuine bright expression of absolute freedom radiated across her young face. George raised his hand and offered a subtle, confirming wave in return. The sprawling, multi-generational conflict was entirely over. The suffocating manipulation and the relentless financial greed were permanently eradicated from his reality. The natural order of his world was restored. George stood on his wooden porch and watched the ocean swallow the last remaining sliver of the sun. A silent, formidable peace reigned over his life.